Chapter 301. The Winter Offensive Begins. Christmas in 1915 was much the same as it had been for the soldiers as it was the year prior. In this life, the Christmas truce did not occur. Perhaps the soldier who had initiated it was killed in the early days of the conflict. Or maybe the enmity between the Allies and the Germans was far greater as a result of the one-sided losses the British and French forces sustained. Either way, men sat in their winter clothing behind their fortifications as the snow fell on their head. The occasional exchange of gunfire and artillery could be overheard in the distance as planes fought in the air above. Conflict never really ceased, as the German stormtroopers found the best way to prevent the positions of the standard infantry from being taken over as routine raids into the Allies' front lines. A few dozen casualties every other night at random intervals kept the British and French forces from properly organizing a mass assault. But it was daytime, not that one could really tell, as the sky was darkened by the winter storm clouds. Even so, flares kept the field alight, as the Germans drank from their canteens and gathered round the fire. Unlike the Austro-Hungarian defenders in the Alps, the Germans' insured men were constantly on watch at their posts, despite the weather and holiday festivities, rotating between men regularly so that no man was ever exposed to the elements for too long. True, the border between Belgium and France was far less hazardous than the Alpine front in the dead of winter, but that did not mean that the temperature could not kill a man if left to its bidding. Because of this, two men were sitting at the edge of a trench, one of them leaning against the sandbags from below, while the other sat on his machine gun. Of these two men, one was German, the other was Belgian. They had long since learned to properly communicate with one another, as they had been more or less in the same mixed unit for close to a year now. The lines at Belgium had frozen after the Germans pushed the French invaders out of the small kingdom, and the camaraderie between the two armies had grown exceptionally since then. With jokes about the origin of Belgium, and the irony that the army they were established as a nation to slow down incursions from was now their greatest friend in their most dire time of need. These two young men in particular, who were no older than 20, had promised to wed each other's sisters should they return from the war unscathed, as they had both seen their fair share of combat together. And perhaps it was because of this bond that they so jokingly referred to each other in a way that only brothers in arms could truly understand. Read exclusive content at Empire. Hey you frog-eating fuck, if your cousins decided to pull a fast one on us and use this dreadful storm as a cover for their assault, how many of them do you think you could kill before you were overrun? The reference to the Belgian soldier being French was a comment that the German soldier kept making because he knew it would get on his friend's nerves. And like the best of pals these two were, the Belgian soldier was quick to fire back at what he knew was the German soldier's sore spot. Well, if you were to actually spend a mere 5 seconds opening a history book instead of playing with yourself in the bunks every night, then you would know that I'm not some baguette-munching Walloon, but rather a man of proud Flemish descent. Now that I think of it, isn't your family from Alsace-Lothringen? So you were French less than 2 generations ago? By all accounts, I'm more German than you are, so you can suck on my frickendel, you fake kraut. The two men broke out into laughter, that is until a shot was fired from nearby, hitting the German soldier on the machine gun square in the dome, dropping him to the ground. At first, the Belgian soldier didn't realize his friend was dead as he scrambled to place his helmet on his head while calling out to the man in panic. Shit, Fritz, are you all right? It was only after silence remained did the man look over to see the body of his friend laying with his eyes wide open in the snow. Immediately, the man rushed over to the edge where the machine gun was, focusing on observing the enemy forces, where he gazed in the distance to see an army of men charging at him, along with the roaring engines of tanks just beyond them. The Belgian soldier immediately broke out into a series of swears as he scrambled over to his now deceased comrade's body, flipping the corpse over and getting on the man's radio where he called in what he was witnessing. After succeeding in conveying the information higher up the chain of command, the man got onto the machine gun, trying his best to avenge his friend before he himself was overrun. Come on, you bastards. Your souls will accompany Fritz in the afterlife, even though you are entirely unworthy, you degenerate fucks. The MG-34 spit out lead at an ungodly rate, tearing through the bodies of the French and British soldiers as they fell by the wayside. only to be ground into human, minced meat beneath the tracks of the Allied tanks, which ruthlessly ran them over. Knowing that the position was lost and reinforcements were still on the way, the moment the machine gun clicked with the sound that the chamber was empty, the Belgian soldier pulled out one of his grenades and grabbed onto the drawstring. Looking down at his deceased brother, he said a silent prayer. By the time he concluded it, the Allied soldiers were already about to jump into his trench line when the most curious thing occurred. A burst of fire from the sky above chewed through the Allied tanks, whose armor was weakest at the top of their turrets. After all, nobody suspected that the tank would come under fire from above, at least not among those who designed them within the British and French armories. Because of this, a standard armor-piercing incendiary round was more than enough to eat through the mere millimeters thickness of riveted steel plates, and in doing so ignited the ammunition within, cooking off the 2-pound shells, which exploded in a display worthy of celebrating American Independence Day. Upon witnessing this explosion, the Allied soldiers hit the ground, staring up at the destruction of their tanks, which were being shot from above by He-51 painted in a striking crimson color. The plane flew by as quickly as it could, followed by more of its kind, which followed their leader in performing the first close air support strike on an armored unit in world history, and in doing so, shredding the Allied armor. By the time the Allied soldiers realized what was happening, German and Belgian troops rushed forward from their nearby positions where they sat around the fire and sang Christmas carols. Now fully in the mood to kill, they lowered their weapons at the French and British infantry who had yet to follow infiltrate the German-Belgian trench line, and in doing so were gunned down instantly by a torrential hailstorm of bullets. Although the Belgian soldier could sigh in relief as he slowly and calmly discarded the grenade in his hands without detonating it, he could not help but feel aggrieved as the man who was his closest friend, a man he had just been speaking with moments ago, was now lying dead in the snow next to him. It was a terrifying thing, to be fine one moment, and having your brains blown out the next without the slightest warning being given. And because of this, he could not help but break down in that moment, trying his best not to shed any tears as he stared into the distance, gazing a kilometer past his own allies, and contemplating how he had ended up in this position to begin with. Chapter 302. The True Meaning of Christmas. Despite the use of tanks on the Western Front in a bold push on Christmas Day at the Belgian border, the attack was ultimately repulsed. With several dozen Allied tanks destroyed and a few hundred men slain, one could easily tell that this was nothing more than an attempt to gauge the fortifications at the border and their ability to defeat armored vehicles. Even so, it wasn't treated as anything much by the German High Command, who were more focused on moving troops, supplies, and most importantly their own armor from the Balkans to the Alps. Rearmament, resupply, and reinforcing losses sustained during the theater of operations were paramount. Russian, Austro-Hungarian, and Greek soldiers would all be marching west, with the easternmost front closed, bringing millions of men into play. Most would be sent to reinforce the Western Front, their objective the same as it had been for the last year. Hold the line until the other theaters of war are closed within the European continent. At the same time, the Austro-Hungarian, Hellenic, and Russian flotilla began to push to encircle and blockade the Italian peninsula. Perhaps they could cut off material aid from Italy via the sea, but the region was connected to France in the west, and could thus easily gain troops and munitions from the border. This was not like Serbia or the Ottoman Empire, which could only rely on its allies for aid via maritime trade. Because of this, one could expect a free exchange of forces between the Alpine Theater and the Western Front. And if this were the case, this would be Bruno's first real test against a major power. The Ottoman Empire could not truly qualify as one of the world's great powers in 1914 when the war began. And while Italy was the least of the great powers, Britain and France were not so easily outclassed. As remarkable as Bruno's military achievements were, a cynical man, or an ideological opponent, could claim he had thrown the weight of the German army at lesser powers, and thus had merely bullied the weak with his conquests. Read the latest on Empire. But that was not a claim that could be made if he steamrolled across the Western Allies, and that was what the world was watching and waiting to see. The treaties which were necessary for concluding the war in the East had been signed, and the holiday season was coming to an end. Because of this, Bruno suspected that come mid-January he and his men would be shipped off to war once again. But that was a worry for another time, because today was Christmas Day. Hours after, the assault on the Belgian border had been concluded, and Bruno had been briefly updated on the situation before returning to his family. Dressed in perhaps the most atrocious Christmas sweater one could possibly imagine, Bruno had gone all out for the holidays. Heidi had entered the room with an equally hideous garment adorned across her torso, but because she was a beautiful woman, she looked quite grand in it, while Bruno, a man, simply looked goofy. The children had gathered by the fireplace wide-eyed and full of excitement, waiting to open their presents. All the while Bruno and Heinrich sat on their seats, joyously partaking of the extra-strength ire punch which Bruno had prepared for the occasion. Considering he was home in time for the holidays after spending the last year at war, he was quite happy with his lot in life. And the hearty drink, which resembled American eggnog, was not the only thing causing this warm sensation. Heinrich noticed Bruno had appeared happier lately, and was quick to make a remark about it, as he reminded the man that their other brother-in-arms was likely out engaging in some less than festive behavior at the moment. "You seem almost like a different person lately, as if your victory in the Balkans has lifted an enormous weight off your shoulders. I almost don't even recognize you." Eric feels the same, you know? Though I bet that bastard is probably off strangling some stray cat right now. That would be how such a sick fuck celebrates Christmas, right? Bruno's cheeks were slightly rosy as he ignored his friend's crude statements of blatant falsehood towards their mutual friend. It was abundantly clear by observing his glazy eyes and his complexion that he had clearly had a bit too much to drink. And because of this, he leaned back in his seat and gazed upon his wife and children, enjoying themselves as they opened their many presents. Presents which were quite humble despite the wealth the family had. Though humble, they were far more personable than something bought from a store, as they had clearly been fashioned by hand. Heidi's hands to be exact. You see, Bruno did not believe in spoiling his children despite their family's extensive fortune. In fact, he hated how Christmas in his past life had been turned into another soulless holiday based entirely on human greed, which was rather antithetical to its original purpose. It was because of this that he had never given his children anything extravagant as a present for holidays, whether that be a birthday or Christmas. At the same time, Bruno had also imposed a strict sense of work ethic among his children. Hell, the older ones were well involved with the war effort, with Eva and Elsa helping their mother around her charitable foundations, while Erwin actively trained at a military boarding school for junior cadets. Even so, not a single one of the children dared complain about the wool socks they received, or any of the other items which their mother had personally crafted by hand for them. In fact, each of their children expressed their heartfelt gratitude towards their parents who had properly taught the true meaning of Christmas a long time ago. When Bruno saw his family happily enjoying treats baked by his wife and presents that the woman had personally stitched together for their children's daily use, he realized just how much he had always desired to celebrate this holiday in such a manner. One that he knew should have been, but never was in his past life. Christmas was never meant to be about pointless consumerism or what lavish gifts you received from family members that might as well be strangers who knew no other way to show their love than by buying you whatever expensive and petty bullshit you thought you wanted because some corporation told you that you needed it. No, Christmas was a holiday fundamentally about faith and family, a time to come together and celebrate the birth of the Savior, even if the day itself wasn't accurate, and to celebrate that day when divinity was born into this mortal world in human form with your loved ones. While reflecting on all of this, Bruno could not help but speak his thoughts aloud without properly thinking them through, something he had rarely ever done in his entire life. Of course I would be happy. Look at the scene before you, my friend. It is everything I have ever wanted in life. After saying this, Bruno put his half-finished drink down and walked over to join his family in the festivities, while Heinrich, perhaps inspired by Bruno's change in outlook on life, was quick to do the same, and with his adopted daughter in tow. Chapter 303. Preparing for the Spring Offensive. The peaceful days with his family did not last long. 1916 had arrived, and with it there was a strange atmosphere in the world. On the one hand, the Allies grew bolder, as they made recent technological advancements that they believed, incorrectly so, could counter the superiority of the German army. But the Germans did the same. And they were not the only ones preparing for this new form of warfare that everyone was starting to begin may very well be the future of how all wars would be fought. Currently, the engagement distances of battles were still for the most part beyond the scope of 300 meters, as men were always taking shots at one another between trenches. Because of this, Bruno had yet to introduce the concept of the assault rifle. But there was another rifle currently in development by the Russian Empire that could prove to be an enormous boon to the Central Powers. I'm talking, of course, about the Fedorov Avtomat. By 1915, the rifle had seen service in Bruno's past life, at least in limited capacity, but some modifications were performed in this life that delayed their entry into the war. For starters, the rifles removed the stubby vertical group added to the front of them. Secondly, the rifle was designed around the 7.92 by 57 mm cartridge, which had become standardized across the main three empires that formed the bulk of the Central Powers' military might. And third, the magazine was changed to an MG 1325 round magazine. The rifle proved so effective in field trials that Bruno had negotiated the license of its manufacture in his own nation, and the Habsburgs did as well. The decision was quickly negotiated for all nations within the alliance to begin domestic manufacture of the Fedorov Avtomat, as well as its magazines, bayonets, and munitions as a replacement for the current standard-issue rifles used by all nations of the Central Powers. In addition to this, the G43, or G05 as it was known in this life, was chosen as the designated sniper rifle for all nations of the Central Powers, with its excess stock to be shared for that role among the other nations of the Central Powers. Sure, the MG34, or MG05 as it was currently known, would remain a weapon of German exclusivity, but the addition of selective fire battle rifles and semi-automatic marksman rifles would greatly increase the firepower in the hands of all the nations within the Central Powers. These preparations were naturally included as one of many as the Central Powers orchestrated their spring offensive within the Alps. The aim was simple. Through overwhelming firepower and mobility, they would push the Italians and their allies back to Rome, where they would be forced to surrender. The hope was that by midsummer of 1916, the Italians would capitulate, leaving one last theater of operations to fight within. Bruno was certain that he could succeed in this endeavor. After all, whether it was the increase in firepower among infantry or his self-propelled anti-tank guns that could more than obliterate any piece of armor that the Allies threw at him, he was all too prepared. Because of this, as the winter began to fade away and the rejuvenation of spring followed suit, the man could not help but gaze out the window of his office with a concerned expression on his face. Reports from the Balkans stated that Eric had served with distinction, hunting down the remaining partisans and obliterating them with ease. The stability of the region had returned, or at least as such an area of the world that was rife with ethnic violence could. After all, the Muslim minority had been withdrawn east of Ionia to rejoin with those who shared their religion. This meant that Albania, Kosovo, and Bosnia were now fully Christian. Albeit, what kind of Christian? Well, that was the question that would inevitably lead to Austro-Hungary's total collapse. Bruno was quite certain of this. Even so, he suspected such troubles had been delayed until after the Great War's end. What would ultimately become of one of the world's great powers when it tore itself apart? That would be the great political question of the 1920s and not the 1910s. Heidi could tell that Bruno was starting to withdraw more and more into his office as the days passed. Not necessarily because he desired to, but more and more work was starting to pile up on his desk. But the most important matter that had Bruno worried about the upcoming year was the 1916 presidential election within the United States. As he was busy with the war effort, he had little time to personally involve himself in American politics. He could only catch up in passing on what was happening across the Atlantic, and the popularity of the America First Committee was apparently waning. The Mexican Revolution had spilled over into the borders of the United States, prompting a demand by some of the more hawkish elements into military reprisal. In addition to this, the justification for invading Mexico was seen by some as being hypocritical when the United States had declared neutrality in other wars abroad. If they invaded Mexico, why could they not send troops to the aid of the Allies fighting in Europe against an ever-encroaching imperial world? Propaganda by those working against Bruno's own interests, such as the Rockefeller and Rothschilds, was in full effect in the USA. declaring the economic and political isolationism of the United States as having been disastrous. Discover stories with Empire. Not only for the well-being of American citizens who saw their quality of life dip as the exclusion of foreign goods from their markets increased prices of domestically produced versions, but also for the cause of liberty around the world. Many political cartoons depicted Lady Liberty weeping blood as she was being strangled by Germania with a German flag. As Bruno came to learn of these propaganda efforts to reignite American militarism after he had done so much in the preceding years to kill such sentiment before it could truly manifest in this life. And hence, Bruno ultimately sighed while gazing out the window, before reaching towards his nearest rotary phone where he dialed the number for an old friend. One who he had not seen since reprimanding him for suggesting the notion of committing war crimes. "Eric, we need to meet in person. Can you find me at the usual place for lunch? Some things are better said in person." After receiving the answer he desired, Bruno hung up without saying another word, before staring out the window at the rain pouring in his villa's courtyard, and his young children dancing around within it. After deep contemplation, Bruno shook his head before turning away from the window, heading towards the door of his office where he grabbed his coat before heading out. But not before taking one last look at the scene outside his office, speaking his own thoughts aloud before departing for his meeting with his mad dog. I do these things so that they may have a future worth living. Chapter 304. Preventive Measures Towards Being Stabbed in the Back. Bruno sat across from Eric. The man seemed to be doing quite well for himself. Recently having gotten back from the Balkans, Eric was clean-shaven and well-groomed. Far more so than Bruno had ever seen the man before, immediately calling into question what the occasion was, and in doing so completely forgetting, at least temporarily, at the reason he had summoned his mad dog to meet with him over lunch. "You sure have cleaned yourself up nicely. What's the occasion? Are you finally going to beat the rumors and marry a nice young lady?" Eric's expression did not sour, unlike how it normally did when Bruno made fun of him for the rumors he had started years in the past. Rumors that persisted because Eric was such a broken man that he had no desire to marry or have a family. Rather, his one fancy was engaging in violence towards other human beings. Yet, surprisingly, the man was in a chipper mood as he responded to Bruno's quip in the most unexpected way conceivable. "First of all, fuck you for that. And secondly, yes. My parents have decided I am far too old and accomplished not to go without a wife. So I will be marrying a young lady of a noble family worthy of my lofty title. Not that it can compare to the likes of you, the Prince of Tula and the Grand Prince of Transylvania." The Prince of Tula was the nickname given to Bruno after he had purchased the lands surrounding the town. They were rich in mineral resources and had been the region which housed many of the Soviet Union and later the Russian Federation's many arms factories during his past life. It wasn't an official title, but it sounded more appealing than simply being a landless prince, and he did technically own those lands in perpetuity, as he had purchased them at rather substantive cost, knowing the full value of them, which had yet to be fully delved into by the Russian Empire. But none of that was important, as Bruno was more interested in the young lady Eric was betrothed to, shocked that it had finally occurred. Even going so far as to make fun of the man, knowing that his parents were no longer willing to tolerate his lack of concern for their family name and legacy. "So, your parents finally decided that the rumors persisting about your alleged sexuality were too much to bear, and that you needed to properly act the part of a nobleman, correct? Do tell me, who was more aggrieved, your mother or your father? Also, who are you marrying? How old is she? Don't tell me you're marrying an old maid, because there's nobody who would rightly marry their daughter off to an alleged pillow biter like yourself." Seemingly unwilling to disclose who his new fiancée was, or the nature of their relationship, Eric's expression grew stern as he turned to the reason Bruno had summoned him here. "Judging by the fact that we are sitting here in public, as the noise of construction hampers bystanders' abilities to listen in on our conversation, and the fact that we are dressing as common men of industry, I am guessing that you didn't call me out of the blue to discuss my personal life. So how about you tell me what you need me to do, and who the target is, so we can get this over with?" Bruno sighed. While sipping on his coffee, Eric was one of the few men who understood his intentions well enough to call them out to his face. And thus he smirked before revealing this notion, as he also described the job he had in mind and the dangers regarding it. You really do know me better than Heinrich does, huh? I should thank you. After all these years, the blood which you have spilled under my orders have never reached his ears, or for that matter, anybody else in power. You have taken the blame without complaint once, even as I have fun at your reputation's expense. What I'm about to ask of you, however, is more than just taking out a few political dissidents. In fact, it borders on high treason. So let me make myself clear. This conversation and its exact details stays between us regardless of whether you choose to accept it or not. You can tell the muscle you need to get the job done whatever assurances you need to, but if you or your men get caught, I will warn you in advance that I will play the part of the fool and act as if you have gone rogue. If need be, I will also condemn you publicly. Hell, I may even be the man whose words end with you being sentenced to the gallows. Knowing all of this, do you still wish to hear what I have to say? Eric did not seem the least bit fazed as he reminded Bruno what his job was, and that he was a man both without thought or conscience towards those he killed. Do you remember who you were speaking with? I am a mad dog, a living weapon to be unleashed on those you wish dead. Simply give me the details, and I will be on my way. That is how it has always been, and will always be, between us. Besides, if I am stupid enough to get caught, then I deserve to take the fall, now don't I? So who is my target? Bruno pulled out a small envelope, which contained a list of names, aliases, addresses, frequently visited locations, etc. And after doing so, he slid it across the table before taking another sip from his coffee while explaining what needs to be done. I know it doesn't really matter to you, but half of the names on this list have already begun to work against the interests of the German Reich and its people. The other half will stab us in the back given the first opportunity to do so, especially if we come close to winning this war as we have planned. As you can see, some of these people are from families that have had the ear of the Hohenzollerns and Habsburgs for as long as they have been in power. To kill even one of their family members would not only bring charges of high treason against you, but would invite the entire wrath of their cabal as well. For the sake of this, I want them all dead. I want their wives dead. I want their children dead. I want their houses rooted out and destroyed entirely. There can be no chance of reprisal against us. I don't care if one of the targets is a newborn infant. If their name is Rothschild, they need to die, period. Do you have the stomach for such gruesome business? Eric looked through page after page of the dossier Bruno had compiled. While the Rothschilds composed a large subsect of targets, bankers, industrialists, academics, politicians, the list went on, and was by no means exclusive to the borders of the German Reich. Some of these targets were across the Atlantic, living safely in the borders of the United States, while others resided in the lands of the Austrian crown, or even the Russian Empire. He would need to dispose of thousands of people who had committed no official treachery that could be proven. Continue reading it, Empire. And yes, Bruno wanted their entire houses destroyed, down to the last woman and child, as no mercy could be granted to those who had stabbed the German army in the back during his past life, despite how close they came during the 1918 spring offensive to strategic victory. Nor could they be granted the opportunity to do the same in this life. Because of this, it took Eric some time to process the information he had been given in its totality. And after doing so, he handed the folder back to Bruno before standing up and dusting himself off. He left with only one parting statement, as he disappeared into the crowd, as if he were a figment of Bruno's imagination to begin with. As I said, I am your mad dog. It will be done. With this in mind, Bruno had just deployed his greatest asset against the enemies of his that remained in the shadows, ones who were constantly conspiring against him from behind the scenes, and some of which were currently pulling the strings in the U.S. election. Chapter 305. Introducing the half-track. Eric had been dispatched on a mission to silently eliminate any threat behind the scenes to the war effort, whether within the boundaries of the Central Powers and the borders of the nations that it was composed of, or abroad, deep behind enemy lines. He was the type of man best left to his own devices after he had been given a task to complete. Frankly speaking, the less Bruno knew of how the man completed his task, the better it was for everyone. An apt comparison would be to say that Eric was like a fire-and-forget missile system. Simply point him at a target, lock him in, and pull the trigger. After that, one did not need to concern themselves with the matter any longer and could engage other targets of priority. There was nobody better at the job Bruno had tasked his old friend with than the man himself. enjoy new adventures from Empire. Because of this, Bruno shifted his focus towards other priorities as he prepared for the upcoming invasion of the Italian peninsula. The objective was simple: transport the German Eighth Army and its supporting elements to the Alps. And there was one thing that his army was currently severely lacking if he truly desired to make the push into Rome as quickly as possible. His engineers had been working overtime with solutions based upon either their own ideas or Bruno's suggestions to come up with new armored vehicles, which would increase the overall firepower and mobility of Bruno's army. While designing a fully enclosed armored personnel carrier was still a few years away from completion, much progress had been made on another form of armored troop transport. The initial up-armoring of 3.5-ton trucks had mitigated casualties for infantry forces deploying into battle, but they had proven to suffer some difficulties in less than ideal conditions. As a result, Bruno's engineers had begun tampering with designs with the 3.5-ton truck chassis on how to make a vehicle better suited towards mobile warfare. And after much trial and error, they discovered that tracks could be mounted to the rear half of the chassis, increasing its ability to cross adverse terrain, while the hull itself could be made of one continuous piece of steel armor, rather than steel plates riveted to an aluminum chassis. The result was the creation of a larger and more powerful version of the SD KFC 251 half-track from Bruno's past life. Not only did this half-track operate as a superior version of a troop transport, insofar as it could protect the soldiers inside its cargo bay with superior protection against enemy fire, but it could also be used in a variety of roles. Whether as an armored ambulance, engineering vehicles, self-propelled guns of all kinds, or even in the roles of reconnaissance and logistics. The half-track proved to be a widely versatile platform, as much as the 3.5 truck, if not more so. The only real downsides it had were simply the fact that it ultimately suffered from inferior speed when compared to a standard 3.5-ton truck platform. So its use in logistics was less than ideal, even if it could serve the role if need be. The tens of thousands of 3.5-ton trucks that were already manufactured were far better suited to this role in war. As Bruno gazed upon the half-tracks in front of him and the wide variety of roles they could fulfill, he had to admit, he had underestimated the intelligence and creativity of the men he employed. They were, after all, some of the best minds suited towards engineering in this current era. But even so, he didn't suspect they would be able to replicate some of the less advanced forms of WW2-era technology so early in this life, with the advice and direction he had already given them. However, after telling them to make a universal tracked armored vehicle chassis platform that could easily be modified and scaled up or down for whatever task it suited, the next logical assumption was to figure out how to do the same with the robust truck chassis he had given these same men. Because of this, Bruno sat there in silence for a long time while his engineers waited for his response. He was thinking through about 1,000 matters altogether, most of which was how best to implement these new weapons before the spring offensive of 1916 began. In fact, Bruno was thinking down to the most minute details of exactly how many of each variant he would need for his combined arms battalions, and what roles they would properly perform, as well as the tactics and training required to pull it off. Currently, the German Eighth Army was about 300,000 infantry, with supporting elements of artillery and tanks, and some anti-aircraft capabilities. This would need to be scaled down to about 50,000 men, or roughly 50 combined arms battalions. These 50,000 men would naturally be composed of his most elite men, while the rest would be transferred to serve in other army groups which were of the older design. The Eighth Army would serve as the prototype for the modern field army, and would preferably be supported by an air wing, which itself would have a variety of aircraft designed to support the combined arms army. After calculating within his head everything he needed to bring a modern army to the forefront of the Great War, Bruno immediately voiced his thoughts aloud, giving notice to the engineers the precise amount of equipment he would need and the time he needed it in. After they ran the numbers, the engineers responded to Bruno's demands as swiftly as they could. "We can have what you request manufactured and ready for combat by the mid of March at the latest." Seeing as how the spring offensive was not intended to begin until April at the earliest, Bruno accepted this answer with a silent nod of his head before departing. With his approval, the half-tracks would immediately begin mass production to serve alongside the armored units already within a service of Bruno's Eighth Army. Meanwhile, Bruno returned from his factory in Berlin to the headquarters that belonged to the Central Division of the German High Command, where he gave voice to exactly how many aircraft he would need to properly mount his assault on the Allies within the Alps. At first, the other generals thought Bruno was mad by saying he needed a single air wing to accompany his Eighth Army, which he would be dividing by 6 of its total size in order to create a smaller, armored, and more mobile combined arms force. But after going through a lengthy discussion of exactly what the restructuring of his army meant and how the rest of the units would be used to support his advance, the man, after all, had an uncanny ability to predict the future of warfare, almost as if he had personally witnessed it himself. And because of this, Bruno got exactly what he wanted. The 2nd Air Wing of the German Combat Air Forces was immediately given orders to prepare as an attached unit to the 8th German Combined Arms Army. At the same time, a grand restructuring within Bruno's forces was being compelled to the men involved. Many of those who had served with Bruno in the Balkan side in relief when they were not selected for the newly reconstituted German Eighth Army, while others were offended that they had not proven themselves to be worthy enough of selection for this elite fighting force. Bruno would ultimately spend the next few weeks assuring each and every one of those who felt some kind of grievance with the selection as to why they were chosen for the role they were given, while also getting his soldiers acquainted with their new tactics and equipment. The very introduction of things like half-tracks and the Fedorov Avtomat as a standard-issue rifle would take much time and practice getting used to. But one thing was certain. By the time February came knocking, each and every German soldier in the 8th Army had undergone enough mock battles and training scenarios where they were well accustomed to the war that was about to be waged in the Alps. In fact, they understood their new equipment on such an intimate level that it might as well have been a family member or a childhood friend. And it was these preparations when introducing new equipment, rather than simply and haphazardly issuing it to soldiers with little more than a crash course to get acquainted with it, that ultimately would set the German army apart from their enemies on the battlefield. Something which Bruno was naturally all aware of due to the life he had lived, and the casualties he had seen sustained by men given new equipment that they had little knowledge of how to operate. After all, no matter how advanced a weapon system may be, if given to a conscript with no training, its advantages were instantly negated. Chapter 306: Massacre in Vienna. If one were observing the private grounds of a particularly wealthy noble family within the borders of the Archduchy of Austria, they would not see the faintest sign of life dwelling within its boundaries. Then again, it was late at night, and all should be asleep by now. But every so often, one might see a small flash of light appear in the window, but no sound to accompany it. Why was this? Because the terror of Belgorod was at work, silently eliminating those threats that lay lurking in the shadows. Threats Bruno wanted out of his way before they could properly manifest themselves. Suppressors were an interesting thing, existing as far back as 1909, if not even early. The technology used within them was about as much the same in the early 21st century as they were in the early 20th century. A tube made out of flame-resistant metals with baffles welded within them. The device was of course threaded directly to the barrel of a firearm that was capable of using it. For example, most revolvers could not be suppressed because they did not have a proper gas seal and would allow excess noise to escape from the cylinder. This was not the case for the Nagant M1895 revolver, which had previously been standard issue to the Imperial Russian Army, and now found itself in the hands of a mad dog let off his leash. With a suppressor of Bruno's own design attached to the barrel of this very revolver, Erich marched through the estate of the infamous Rothschild family and did the Lord's bidding. After all, in the words of the fictional preacher Joshua Graham, we can't expect God to do all the work. The hammer was raised by Erich's thumb as he aimed the weapon down in the darkness and squeezed the trigger while the suppressor was pressed firmly against the skull of the master of the house, who was on his knees pleading for mercy. Mercy? Erich knew no such word, and as his face was hidden behind a balaclava, all that could be witnessed beneath the smirking skull imprinted upon its fabric was the vague outline of a matching expression from the unknown demon whose visage lay beneath. Not a single word was spoken as the firing pin attached to the hammer of the revolver struck the primer on the back of the round, igniting the powder within the cartridge and propelling the 7.62 millimeters cartridge into the skull of the victim, whose blood and gray matter was blasted all over the floor of his bedroom, while his wife, who was still kneeling by his side, shrieked in dismay. Having heard the loud and obnoxious wailing of the recently made widow, Eric frowned as he struck the woman across the head with the grip of his pistol. He was never the type to let a perfectly good excuse for violence to go to waste. The sudden blunt force trauma to the temple of the woman knocked her unconscious instantly, and not wanting to waste another round, Eric stashed his revolver in its holster, which was purposely designed to allow the suppressor to stick out, where he then pulled out a Pathfinder knife. The knife had the same Totenkopf made famous by the Iron Division embedded in its scales, while the blade was inscribed with the German words Blut und Eisen, or in the English tongue, blood and iron. The knife had been granted to those members of the Iron Division after the war was over, as a commemoration of their volunteered service within the Russian Civil War, and was found on the person of many NCOs and officers currently serving in the Great War today. Bruno also had one such knife on his person at all times. It was as much a tool for survival as it was a weapon to kill the enemy should the need arise. And with this weapon, Eric stuck the unconscious matriarch of the Rothschild family through the heart, like a butchered pig, as he ended her life then and there. After doing so, he turned around to find a curiosity gazing at him. The teenage girl was no older than 16 as she saw her parents lying dead on the ground before her. The screams and sounds of muffled gunfire had awoken her from her sleep. Apparently, Eric had missed her in his cleansing of the wretched house. Due to the darkness of the hallways at the devil's hour of which currently reigned supreme, she had not witnessed the massacre of her other family members in the halls, nor her siblings who Eric had already disposed. She did not say a single word to the murderer who she caught in the act, as she stared at him with hate-filled eyes. Eric, however, did not immediately fetch his revolver to end the little girl, nor did he make an aggressive move towards her with the knife. Instead, he wiped the blood on the nightgown of who it belonged to, before stashing it away back in his pocket. Only after which did he pull his pistol out of its holster and aim it at the girl whose ferocious gaze did not waver in the slightest. The hatred in your eyes, I know it all too well, for I see it every time I look in the mirror. But luckily for you, you won't have to live with such unbridled rage for long, because I am going to reunite you with your family in hell where you all belong right this instant. Bang! The massacre of the Austrian branch of the Rothschild family, a family who was renowned for their wealth and history of bankrolling the Habsburgs, had shocked the world within the papers the next morning. Not a single soul lived to tell the tale of who had infiltrated their home and killed them all down to the last potential heir. Bruno read the paper while sitting at the breakfast table, enjoying his morning coffee with a stoic gaze as he looked at the paper. It was not until he saw the grave look on his eldest daughter's face did he realize something was wrong, especially since her eyes were frozen, staring at the headline. Bruno had no choice but to ask about why his daughter was acting so strangely, as he did so with a gentle tone in his voice, one which he normally used to communicate with his daughters. Eva, is everything all right? It looks like you have seen a ghost. Don't tell me you are disturbed by the headline. A tragedy to be sure, but one that it is not a concern of our family. Having heard her father's concern in his voice, Eva snapped back to reality, before explaining why she was so distraught, but only after taking a few breaths to calm herself beforehand. I'm sorry, father, it's just that. You know I am friends with Princess Sophie, right? Princess Sophie? As in Princess Sophie of Hohenberg, the sole daughter of the late Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie of Hohenberg? Since when did his daughter know such an important figure? Bruno stared at his daughter with an inquisitive gaze. That is until Heidi brought over a plate full of his favorite breakfast and placed it in front of him. Your next read is at Empire. You have been so busy preparing for this war that you didn't even think about what to do with the Archduke's children after the tragedy that befell their parents. Naturally, as your better half, I had it covered. I immediately arranged for their well-being to be looked after, both by their family members and our own. Because of this awful business, our daughter and the princess have quickly become the closest of friends. They are roughly the same age after all, born in the same year in fact, and our daughter is the Grand Princess of Transylvania now. It only makes sense, no? This was of course news to Bruno, but that was a matter for another time. And because of this, Bruno was quick to follow this information to the logical conclusion. He appeared to be missing. I did not know that, and I would love to hear more about it. But Eva, what does your friendship with Princess Sophie have to do with the Rothschilds? After a brief summary of her friendship with the Princess of Hohenberg and their inner circle, it would appear that Eva knew one of the Rothschilds slain in the massacre vicariously through her Habsburg friend. In fact, she had spoken to the girl relatively recently and was shocked that something so horrible had happened to someone she personally knew and had been in contact with only a week prior. Bruno felt a bit guilty, having unwittingly and accidentally caused his beloved daughter some mental anguish, and because of this he was quick to console her, while giving her some life advice. I'm sorry to hear that. I didn't know you two were on friendly terms. But Eva, this is why you should cherish each moment you have alive on this earth, especially those happy moments surrounded by friends and loved ones. Sooner or later death comes for us all, and sometimes in sudden ways which we have no way of anticipating. And in the end, all that will remain will be your memories of those departed. Hence, you understand now why I always try to be on the best of terms with you and your siblings, as well as those who are important to me. Because it would be a terrible thing to part on unfavorable terms with a loved one, would it not? Despite the fact that the girl had broken out into tears, she hugged her father lovingly, taking his advice to heart, and swearing never to let herself be compelled to say or do something she would regret to any of her loved ones. As for Bruno, he stroked his little angel's golden hair as he comforted her, feeling regret for what he had ordered Eric to do. Not out of any empathy for the victims who were killed under his command, but because of the pain he had unknowingly caused his daughter as a result of the bloodshed. Chapter 307. Rebellion is in the air. Both sides were preparing for a major zone of conflict to break out in the next few months, and it was universally understood by all the parties involved in the Great War that it would occur within the Alps, as Italy was the weakest link of those that remained at war with the Central Powers. However, while minor skirmishes were occurring on the front lines that had held firm in a bloody stalemate for the course of a year, more intense engagements were occurring in the Far East. The Royal Thai Army had joined with the Imperial Japanese Army to catch the British and French in the region off guard, and were currently attacking French territories in Southeast Asia from both sides. However, that was not the only theater of operations where war was being fought in the region. Within the Indian subcontinent, a familiar face stood within the markets of Delhi. His pale white skin and fire-red hair were a dead giveaway to his foreign origins. Even so, he dressed in the attire of the locals while walking through the city streets. His ability to blend in with a foreign land, despite his obvious heritage being European, was truly commendable. Maximilian even walked straight past the soldiers of the British Raj, whose rifles were loaded and slung around their backs. They did not think anything of this foreigner in a city filled with primarily locals. After all, trade had recently been picking up as a result of the war. Whatever else may result from battle, it was always good for business, at least for certain countries, and because of this, more than a few foreigners were walking the streets of Delhi these days. At least enough for it not to be suspicious. Because of this, agents of the German Reich could walk freely through its streets, and so long as they did not behave in overtly suspicious behavior, then they would not be stopped. Maximilian, by now, had gotten quite accustomed to engaging in operations abroad on behalf of German intelligence. He had facilitated the Arab Revolt and its success in the field against the Ottoman Empire, and now he was asked to do the same within the British Raj. By now, the Ghadar Party and its more militant members had made their way to the Punjab region of India in the attempts to spark an armed rebellion against the British Raj. Their party was one primarily made of expatriates who wanted an independent India. In Bruno's past life, they had brokered agreements with the Germans in preparation for the Great War and attempted to lead a mutiny against the British Army, one that, for various reasons, failed to achieve its goals. However, things were not the same as they once were. The Central Powers were winning, to put it simply. Everyone knew it. And even minor powers like Thailand were taking up arms to join them in this fight against the Allies. Your journey continues with Empire. This made things easier for the Germans to manipulate within areas the British Empire and French Republic controlled. For example, as Maximilian walked down a narrow alleyway and found himself face to face with an aging and rickety door, he thought about what he carried in his ruck. A large pack sat upon Maximilian's back, one that had it been inspected by the British troops he just passed by, would have resulted in his arrest and probably execution as an agent of the German crown. But they had not done so, and thus he was able to knock in a specific pattern on the door, prompting it to open, and in doing so, revealing a young boy whose face was concealed by a makeshift hood fashioned from an old burlap sack. The boy took one look out the holes, which were poorly carved out of his hood, and was quick to speak to Maximilian in his native tongue, something which dear old Max had spent enough time mastering to be conversational with the locals. And as a result, he was able to reply with the proper response, permitting him entry into the building, where once he had done so, he laid down his pack in front of the men gathered within, many of which were military-aged males. Once he opened the pack to reveal several firearms, grenades, and cases full of munitions, the militants were quick to open their eyes wide in surprise. They did not expect the Germans to fulfill their promise. But now that they had done so, the leader of this small cell of the Gatter party thanked Maximilian for his efforts before ushering him away. The conversation was brief and to the point, and Maximilian did not want to stick around long enough to find out what these men were going to use these weapons for, or how they would go about it. His job was simply to coordinate between the various cells spread across the Punjab region of India, and the task the main party had given him was to bring the weapons to these men, along with a small slip of paper which he had handed them. Whatever they were supposed to do was on this paper, and that was all Maximilian needed to know. Thus he departed without saying another word after completing his task, and returned to the main party, or their host, where he would coordinate between them and the German Reich on the rebellion that was about to kick off within the Indian subcontinent. A rebellion that would start with the execution of a high-ranking military officer loyal to the British Crown, followed by a major mutiny, one that would inspire others to take up arms and fight for their independence. The tides of war were ever-changing, and the victories gained by the Central Powers had begun to inspire the rebellious populations beneath the British and French crown to throw off the yoke of their masters and fight for their own sovereignty. And, of course, Germany would facilitate these independence movements, as they had done in the Levant and as they were now doing in India. Chapter 308. An intimate moment in an otherwise chaotic time. Bruno stood in front of a mirror within his own home, adjusting the collar of his tunic as it found its way over the metal dangling from beneath its folds. Perhaps it was because he had been working out more than usual, as he had nothing else to do while waiting for the orders to deploy. But for some reason, the uniform he wore just a few months prior to receive his honors and titles from the Austro-Hungarian emperor seemed a bit stiff, and because of this prevented him from properly performing the act. Naturally, he grew quite flustered and began to frown, as he felt a pair of dainty and soft hands reach from behind and perfectly secure the fit he was struggling to achieve. Heidi had deliberately hid from the view of the mirror as she did this, causing Bruno to flinch in shock at suddenly being touched from behind. He turned around to see his loving and elegant wife dressed in her own lavish attire that was suitable for an empress. She was smirking at him with a taunting gaze, while speaking with a playful tone in her heavenly voice. "What? A brave and strong soldier like yourself is afraid of a dainty little maiden like me? Where is your pride, sir?" Bruno did not remotely feel offended by the woman as she feigned insults at his honor, and instead took a shameless pose as he blatantly examined her dress and figure. Whether it be the extravagant white dress, which, like Bruno's tunic, had golden embellishments, or the sheer lace elbow gloves that clung tightly to Heidi's perfectly sculpted arms, the woman looked like an angel descended from the heavens, and one might actually be able to make this argument, that this woman was not human, but actually an angel of the Lord, as the ribbon pinned below her bust was proof of her exceptional charitable deeds. Bruno was not the only one rewarded by the Habsburgs for what he had done in this life. In fact, Heidi's charitable efforts were so effective that they had spread beyond the boundaries of the German Reich and coordinated with local groups in other nations affected by the war. Because of this, the woman had been rewarded by the Habsburgs with the Imperial Austrian Order of Elizabeth, which was more or less the Austrian equivalent of the awards she had already been granted by the kingdoms of Prussia and Bavaria. Upon seeing the ravishing woman smirk and make fun of him with a gentle, yet playful tone in her voice, Bruno couldn't help but drag his wife into his arms and kiss her on the lips, before making his way down to her graceful neck, which he too placed his lips upon, all while scolding her on her taunts. Afraid? Never. I'm utterly terrified of you, my little angel. The intimate scene was quickly interrupted by a very loud and noticeable cough, causing the Grand Prince and Princess of Transylvania, who appeared as if they were straight out of a fairy tale, to gaze over at their children, who were standing embarrassed in the doorway, equally dressed in elegant fashion. Heidi began to blush and avert her eyes, much in the same way her children did, especially Erwin, who was the first to break the awkward silence that persisted between the family. If we don't get moving, we will miss the train. It is a long way to Transylvania, no? Having been granted Transylvania as his family's personal lands, as if he were some kind of medieval prince ruling over his own fief, Bruno wanted to visit the lands his family were granted and to try to do what he could to improve the well-being of what were more or less his citizens. He was an extremely well-educated man and intelligent in ways that few others in human history could claim to equal. He also had 2 lifetimes' worth of experience to draw from, making Bruno an ideal candidate to take a glance over the laws on the books and the ongoing economic state of the Grand Principality. Thus, he wanted to do this before he had to step foot on another battlefield, as he felt neglecting such affairs when he had the opportunity to at least begin improvements in some fashion would be woefully negligent on his part. Hence, after stopping his intimate act with his wife, Bruno assured his children that he and their mother were ready to depart. We are ready, yes, love? Heidi nodded her head, the redness of her face not fully dissipated, yet as the embarrassment of being caught in such a compromised position by her children was too much for her to handle. While rather tame by the degenerate standards of the 21st standards, it was not something those in the era would find suitable to display in front of their children. And Heidi was naturally of such mind, as she quickly scurried off out of the room, shouting at Bruno as she did so. I'll be waiting for you all in the car. Bruno took one last look at himself in the mirror before following his wife out of their family estate within the boundaries of Berlin. He couldn't help but having a warm smile on his face as he nodded to his own reflection. He truly looked the part of a prince from a fairy tale, and was living a life he had never once thought was possible. And now he would go to the lands which he ruled as prince. It was a dream come true. Your next chapter is on empire. And yet as he enjoyed these luxurious, the Great War was still raging across Europe, Africa, and Asia. But, for the time being, until Bruno was once more called into action, he had nothing to do but enjoy the brief time he was given with his loved ones. Naturally, a family vacation to the lands of Hungary was something he very much looked forward to. And apparently, so too did his family. Chapter 309. Haus von Zehntner Siebenbergen. The train ride to Transylvania from Berlin was a long but pleasant one. Bruno and Heidi's youngest children had been born only a few years earlier than the outbreak of war, and the last few years had not exactly been without fruit as well. Bruno and Heidi were now at 8 children, and presumably by the time he returned to his home next there would be a 9th. The eldest, of course, was Eva, who was followed by Bruno's current heir, Erwin, after which was the youngest of the first crop of children, Elsa. From there were the 3 boys in the middle, who were named Joseph, Heinrich, and Wilhelm, followed by 2 more daughters, those 2 being Anna and Erika. Erika, having only been born this last year, was the youngest of Bruno and Heidi's children. Considering Bruno had not been home for the most part of the last 2 years, he had been a largely absent figure of his younger children's lives. This meant that there was a very obvious rift between them and the elder children, who had for the most part lived with their father in their home for the majority of their lives. Eva, Erwin, and Elsa were all clinging to their father, fearing that the moment he vanished he would never return, as they were all too aware of the price in German blood that had been waged to avenge their Austrian allies, and the royalty which God had ordained the rightful rulers of the Österreich. Whereas the younger children were far more aloof, having not truly known their father within their short memories, and thus were more intimidated by his presence. While slightly better than a stranger to them, he was indeed far too absent due to the poor timing of the war for these kids to feel comfortable in his presence. Or so was the case for the first few weeks following Bruno's victorious return from the Balkans. However, after the months he had been home since, and the extensive journey from Berlin to Bran, which was the small Transylvania town where they would be taking up their residence for the duration of their stay in the region. Bruno had become much closer to his youngest children. Eventually, the family arrived at a historic monument, a castle from a distant era, one that had quite the legacy. For you see, the legendary Bran Castle had been the home of the Teeps dynasty, meaning it was the residence of the infamous Vlad the Impaler, who had been the inspiration for Dracula. In other words, this was Dracula's castle, which Bruno and his family would be staying at, as Transylvania had no actual modern palace for Bruno and his family to reside in during their time in Hungary. When his family got out of their luggage, they saw the banners of Austro-Hungary waving on a flagpole, with the colors of Transylvania just below. And watching this blue, red, and yellow wave with the winds of spring, Bruno suddenly came to a realization. He now by right had the ability to form his own noble house, or I should say a cadet branch of his grandfather's house, the House von Zehntner Siebenbürgen. Siebenbürgen being the German name for Transylvania. And the banner waving in the distance gave the man an idea for his own coat of arms. He would take a shield with the colors of the Transylvania flag in the background. And from there, he would add his family's own sigil on top of it, which was a black eagle displayed with a golden beak, legs, and talons, along with white eyes and a red tongue. The eagle also had a with gold cleestangel, which was a form of crest on its chest that ended with trefoil on both sides. If one wanted an example of this, they could look up the Tyrolean or Brandenburg eagles. From there, he would add a smaller shield on its chest, which would house the banner of the Iron Division within it. In other words, a black background with a white Totenkopf of the Freikorps era from his past life. After this, he would add a golden crown on the eagle's head, along with a scepter clutched by one of its talons, and an orb held by the other. In fact, now that Bruno thought of it, didn't this mean that the Austrian Kaiser just made him more or less a monarch capable of creating his own state decorations? Bruno would have to follow up with a conversation with Franz Joseph about this before the old man kicked the bucket, because if so, he might actually possess some form of autonomy, much in the way the German federal monarchy existed. And if that was the case, he would add whatever chain came from creating such an order of merit. After standing in the courtyard thinking through these plans, Bruno also realized that when Austro-Hungary finally collapsed in the coming years, he would be right to be the ruler of Transylvania as its independent sovereign, which could put him at odds with the Kaiser. This definitely complicated matters, and in addition to the lands he owned in Russia, he might just have to create multiple cadet branches of his grandfather's house for his 3 eldest sons to rule over. But that was a matter for another time, and Bruno realized this as Heidi grabbed his shoulder and brought him back to reality. This is quite the beautiful, albeit quaint, old castle. Is this where we are staying? Bruno nodded his head, before taking his wife's hand into his own and kissing it gently, before assuring her that this was indeed where they would be staying. Of course, you may not realize it, but there is quite the marvelous history within these ancient walls. This used to be the home of one of history's most notorious monsters. Now come let us get temporarily acquainted with our temporary residents. There is much work to be done to look after the region, and I am sure that by the time the war begins I can improve it in a myriad of ways. Heidi did not know that these were the walls which Vlad the Impaler once called home, nor did she really care about such ancient history. She was just happy to be in a real-life castle, and not a modern palace. It was almost like stepping into the distant past and reliving it from her own perspective. And as she walked through the halls of the castle, this is exactly what Heidi felt, as well as a few of her children, especially the youngest, as she made wild tales to them about knights and princesses and trolls and dragons, of which Bruno heard and chuckled lightly, before shifting his head back to them. Heidi, don't fill the kids' heads with such nonsense. We are in Transylvania. Here could there be vampires. In fact, this is the castle that Dracula once called home. Even Heidi's face went pale as she heard these words, before looking at her husband as if he were making a cruel joke to her, before realizing he was very serious, as he had said moments ago that this castle was the residence of one of history's most notorious monsters. Her voice was almost filled with trepidation as she begged her beloved for clarification on the matter. Enjoy new tales from Empire. Honey, you didn't. Bruno, of course, leaned in close and held the woman's dainty chin, mocking her with a smug smirk before walking off. What? Don't tell me you're actually afraid of vampires, my love. Relax, I can attest that Dracula was not a real historical figure. His character was merely based upon the man who once ruled over this castle. Sadistic as he may have been, he is long since dead, I assure you of this. Look at you. You look quite adorable when you are so frightened. One might even say delicious. Bruno's last words struck a nerve with his wife, causing her to pout as he walked through a dark doorway, seemingly disappearing into its shadows as he did so. That's not funny, Bruno. But Bruno remained utterly silent as he continued to walk through the darkness, pretending his best to project an aura of dreadful mystique. That is until about 5 seconds later when he walked straight into a wall, which he could not see due to the lack of proper lighting within the castle, and in doing so cursed up a storm as he coped with the pain in his foot. Motherfu. Heidi tried to contain her laughter as she reminded the man that their youngest children were quite literally huddled by her side, and in doing so cut him off before he could finish the word he wanted to say most of all. Language, dear. Bruno then walked out back into the light, pretending as if he had not just done something tremendously foolish, and instead insisted upon acquiring some candles from the local village as soon as possible. Heidi, do be a doll and tell our staff to fetch some much-needed candles. It would appear we will be living without electricity for some time. Heidi could help but laugh at her husband's misfortune, thinking to herself that it served him right for trying to scare her and their kids with such a chilling story about the castle's history. And in doing so, she promised to convey his orders to the staff they brought with them for the duration of their stay in Transylvania. I'll be sure to let them know. Chapter 310. The War in the East continues. Getting accustomed to a life without modern luxuries was indeed something that Bruno had to relearn. He had been born in this life a year after the first private electric system was installed in Edison's own home, and as a result, it would be several more years before the wealthy nobles of the German Reich got their hands on such technology. As a result, Bruno had lived his first few years of his new life without electricity, which was a chore to be sure, but one he gradually became accustomed to. Only for the moment he truly began to thrive in such a primitive environment, his family's estate was retrofitted to include it. His children, however, had never known a world without the modern luxury, and as a result, there was quite a bit of complaining and squabbling over the many chores that their mother forced them to aid the house staff with whom they had brought with them to Transylvania. Nevertheless, Bruno and his family enjoyed a nice meal together in the evening before the man returned to the castle study, where he was quick to go over the list of papers the Transylvanian government sent him at his personal request. Whether it was the codification of law or the local economic status, things were more or less how Bruno had expected that would be, and he was quick to overhaul many matters. Bruno, having extensive experience in running international corporations, was quick to cut the bloat, so to speak. Arresting corrupt politicians, firing incompetent government bureaucrats, and shutting down departments that had no practical reason for existing. If there was a way for him to cut the government expenditure that did not affect the people of Transylvania or the daily function of the government, then by God he did it. Stay updated with Freeweb novel. In addition to this, he changed the codification of laws, adding heftier penalties to crimes which were more deserving, while removing laws that had existed for centuries which made no sense whatsoever in a modern context. Bruno also began to levy taxes to a far more ideal margin, one that not only gave the people of Transylvania a break, but also stimulated economic growth. In addition to this, he began to invest his personal money into the mechanization of the local agriculture. Transylvania was a nation that had extensive potential for agriculture. It could theoretically become the breadbasket of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But lack of investment in the region meant that the industry was still relying on technology and techniques one would have found in the pre-industrial era. As a result, Bruno ordered thousands of tractors with his personal funds and began to invest in the domestic production of agricultural equipment so that the people of Transylvania could routinely replace aging parts on their tractors without having to pay extensive import fees from places like the German Reich, where Bruno's factories and engineers had already revolutionized the field of mechanized agriculture. Whether it was diesel-powered tractors, combined harvesters, seeders, or any other form of equipment necessary to make modern agriculture easier on the farmers, Bruno had invested heavily in its development. It was actually something that most people were not aware of. Only those at the top of the company knew that Bruno was the primary shareholder. And it wasn't just mechanization that Bruno had invested heavily into when it came to agriculture. He also paid substantial sums in acquiring talents necessary to advance the fields of chemicals related to agriculture. These technologies would be exported to Transylvania through a series of contractual agreements that allowed the region to produce and sell them locally under their own local companies. And after an extensive first day, Bruno soon realized that he was burning the midnight oil and would thus need to get some proper rest. Thus, for the night, he went to sleep and would awake again to begin his work once more at the crack of dawn. Thunder crackled over the skies of Southeast Asia. The shores had been surrounded by the combined might of the Royal Thai Navy and the Imperial Japanese Navy, while Marines stormed the shores of what would one day be known as Myanmar, currently occupied by the British Empire as a part of the Raj. Japanese and Thai soldiers alike rushed through the slow chug of heavy machine guns. The French soldiers trying desperately to clear the jams of their outdated weaponry, while the British Vickers functioned flawlessly as it always had. Men dropped by the wayside as artillery hit the shores, striking the concrete bunkers and collapsing them upon the men within. No matter how fortified your structure may be, it could never withstand the wrath of a coastal bombardment performed by dreadnought-style battleships. Such was a lesson the British and French defenders were learning now, as their positions were either struck by naval guns or overrun by the overzealous invaders. The addition of Thailand to the Central Powers had significantly aided their military supremacy in the East, which was already extensive considering the Imperial Japanese Army was proving a greater threat than the Allies had initially anticipated. The British commander in the rear of the trenches was calling on the radio for support from the British Navy, whose eastern fleets by now had either been sunk to the bottom of the Pacific or forced back to colonial ports for repairs and rearmament. The beating they had taken had given the Central Powers complete and total command over the Eastern world, and with the Suez Canal now closed as it was currently under occupation of the Central Powers and their Arab allies, sending reinforcements to the region required an extensive journey around the Cape of Good Hope. South Africa had joined their lot in with the Allies, sending their army into German Southwest Africa, and in doing so, expelling German colonial forces from the region. This was actually the single greatest Allied victory thus far in the war. But because it was a colonial affair far away from the European mainland, few civilians knew of it, nor cared for it either. Because South Africa was a member of the Allies, the British Navy had a friendly port to refuel for their journey east. Even so, it was a long and perilous journey, and reinforcements had yet to arrive in the Pacific despite Japan invading most of the Allies' colonial assets in the region. But hopefully, men could be pulled from other outposts nearby within the British Raj to aid in this sudden and hostile invasion of the territory's easternmost borders. However, the British commander received a simple order and no estimated time of arrival. Hold your positions until reinforcements arrive, no matter what the cost. After hearing this, the commanding officer damn near destroyed the radio in a fit of rage, prompting the soldiers nearby to question what he had been told. So what did they say? As if the answer wasn't already blatantly obvious, the British commander scowled before responding in the most sarcastic way possible. An army of 100,000 men is immediately inbound to our position with air support and tanks to match. What do you fucking think, you useless twat? Even the thick-headed soldier could understand that this was not a serious response, and thus after the commander took a deep breath to calm his nerves, he was quick to relay their actual orders. ETA for reinforcement is unknown, but our orders are to hold this position until they arrive no matter what the cost. A grim look appeared on the faces of those present to hear these orders from British colonial high command, as they knew all too well what the current situation was. The commander naturally knew the situation better than anyone and was thus quick to strap on his helmet. The moment he realized there was no hope, he decided to give the order that would save his men, even if it was one that would ultimately have him court-martialed and potentially executed for insubordination. There is no point throwing our lives away for this beachhead. Give the order at once to withdraw further inland. We will establish a stronghold up north and reunite with reinforcements when they arrive to drive these yellow bastards out of the British Raj once and for all. No doubt, the expressions on the soldiers' faces were relieved when they heard they were not going to throw their lives away in a futile attempt to hold on to the beachhead, as there was no chance of victory, or holding out for more than 3 hours at this point. And they knew that if an ETA had not been given on the arrival of reinforcements, then it would be far too late for any of them by the time they actually appeared to help with the fight. Thus, the British and French forces were quick to retreat further inland in an attempt to fortify their position as a strategic location and hoping to catch the Imperial Japanese Army and Thai Royal Army off guard when they did so. Chapter 311. A perfect ruler. What a sight that would be. The Allied forces were preparing for a major offensive in response to their failure in the Balkans. And while chaos erupted across their colonial possessions, no doubt instigated by the German Reich and their allies within the Central Powers, their eyes were once more cast upon Luxembourg. Having tested the combined defenses of the Royal Belgian Army and the Imperial German Army at Belgium's borders with France, and were once more repelled by their adversaries, the Allied powers came to the conclusion that if they were to funnel their combined might into Luxembourg, they would be able to push back the Germans and gain a much-needed foothold on the Western Front. They came to this conclusion specifically because Luxembourg was the weakest of the German defenses in the West. Only a single division stood at its border with France. From the German perspective, creating a failure point in their defense was necessary, because they could predict with perfect certainty where the enemy would be coming from when they finally made their move, as it was the most likely point to fail, and could thus throw men into the fire to reinforce the position once the bullets began to fly. Whereas if they did not have such a point, the enemy could attack from anywhere at any given time, and in doing so could catch them stretched thin. Luxembourg exists as the weakest line of defense because it was the smallest border the Germans shared with the Allies, and it could be used as a trap to entice the enemy into foolishly seeking their own doom. It was perhaps because of this that the Allies began mustering their armored and aerial forces towards the border of Luxembourg, while at the same time the Germans began mobilizing their newly reforged Eighth Army, which to the Alps where they hoped to smash the Italians in the face with a war hammer so powerful and swift that it knocked them clear out of contention for the winning from the start. Either way, the amassing of forces for coordinated offensives was none of Bruno's concern at the moment. He had done all that he could in preparation for the spring offensive, which was coming later than he had initially expected it to due to the time necessary to reform the Eighth Army into a modern combined arms force of considerably smaller scale than it had previously been. Instead, he continued to use his authority as the Grand Prince of Transylvania to introduce a series of reforms that would set the foundation for the region's future as a largely self-sufficient region. Frankly speaking, Bruno did not know how long his family would hold on to Transylvania, as when Austro-Hungary collapsed its future would be uncertain, both as a sovereign Grand Principality and as a province of the Hungarian Crown lands. It was entirely possible that as in his past life the region would be annexed by Romania, or perhaps he could use his influence over European politics to maintain the sovereignty of the cadet branch of his house, which was officially established in Transylvania. But the fate of Austro-Hungary and his position as a monarch over one of its current possessions was definitely a matter that would put his loyalties to the German Reich to the test. As the Grand Prince of Transylvania, Bruno now had a responsibility to its people. Their lives were his to look after the best interests of. Except Bruno had never wanted to be in such a position. Heavy is the crown, and the responsibility of looking after an entire region of people was a burden he never wanted to bear. Nearly 8 million people currently lived in Transylvania. Their lives and well-being was now Bruno's responsibility to look after. The difference between holding authority over a few 100,000 men as a general and millions of men, women, and children was about as vast as the earth which Bruno stood upon and the stars above within the night sky. It was a terrible and overwhelming responsibility. Sure, Bruno had fancied himself a knight of old as a child in his past life, and sometimes the prince who would save the damsel in distress. But as he grew into adulthood and found himself in positions of command over dozens, hundreds, and thousands of young men, he knew all too well that leading a nation was a cross far too great for him alone to bear. And yet he had been thrust into this position in his life. With an uncertain future, he did not wish a single one of the roughly 8 million citizens who now called him their monarch to endure the hardships that were to come. With all of this in mind, he spent day after day in the old castle, doing his best to at the very least ensure a brighter future for the region. For once the day come, should it be necessary to surrender his current title and status as the sovereign of these lands to spare the suffering of those within his responsibility to lead, he would gladly do so, hoping that he had bought them enough prosperity that they could stand on their own 2 feet. But for the time being, all Bruno could really do was work tirelessly to ensure that his lands were prosperous, and the people in them were living lives free from corruption, crime, and despair, at least as much as was humanly possible. Read latest chapters at Freeweb Novel. After all, it would not be long before he was once more called off to war. And when that happened, his time playing as a prince, leading the people he had been granted dominion over, would be like a fleeting dream. One had to ask, was there ever really such a thing, a perfect ruler? Whether aristocratic, dictatorial, or democratically elected, who in history could say that they led their nation without the slightest fault? What a sight that would be! Alas, such notions were mere fantasy, and sadly, as Bruno had long since painstakingly realized, he did not live in such a delusion. No, he lived in reality. And reality was painfully imperfect. Chapter 312. The Allied counterattack begins. Gunfire echoed in perfect tandem with the roar of engines and artillery. The spring offensive of 1916 had begun, but it was not the Central Powers who had moved their pieces on the chessboard into play first. Nay, that boast belonged to the Allies, who came crashing over the German fortifications built at the edge of Luxembourg like a tidal wave of steel. Frankly speaking, the defenses were light, and the battle was brief, a mere skirmish, if you would. It was such a rapid and unexpected victory at the border that while the Allied troops began to cheer and embrace one another for their first major win in God knows how long, the commanders began to speculate that something was seriously wrong. But after thoroughly searching the area, no signs of treachery could be found, and thus it could only be concluded that their armor had truly trounced the enemy. But if this were truly the case, then why? Why were there no flak guns, which in time past had shredded their tanks, both at the Alpine Theater and in Belgium? Better yet, why were there no German planes soaring above the sky? The officer in charge of the French brigade that was in the vanguard was a man who Bruno knew all too well from his past life. Or, more accurately, knew of all too well. Charles de Gaulle, having miraculously escaped from a German prisoner of war camp after the unit he was a mere junior officer in was decimated in the first wave of the war. Charles returned to France, where he gained some success in minor skirmishes with the enemy, and had quickly risen through the ranks to the position of colonel. Why was he made a colonel despite his relatively young age and lack of experience? Because the French had lost hundreds of thousands, if not over 1 million men so far in the war, and many of them were officers of every rank. Even French generals had not been spared the Grim Reaper's scythe in this war. And because of this, any officer who remotely showed some intelligence, capability, and ingenuity in the field was placed on a fast track to promotion. Because Charles de Gaulle had seen how adept the Germans were at preparing for this war, and tricking their enemies into attacking precisely where they desired, he was the only man highly skeptical about this whole affair. In fact, he outright voiced his concerns about pushing further into Luxembourg before their scouts could verify whether or not the enemy was lying in wait for them. But eager for further glory, after having been starved of it for 2 whole years, the general placed in command of the Anglo-French force, which pushed into Luxembourg's borders, ignored these concerns. What would a mere 25-year-old officer with limited experience understand about seizing the opportunity when it was presented to you? Because of this, Charles was quickly chastised and threatened with being stripped of his command should he press the matter further. With a heavy sigh, the notorious man who would one day become the president of France, that is, if he were given the opportunity to thrive in this life as he had done in Bruno's past, could only return to his unit and tell them to be on the lookout for potential traps and tricks. After which, he loaded on top of one of the Mk2 tanks that was painted with the colors of the French army, and began pushing forward with his unit towards the city of Luxembourg, where the enemy had pulled back to in order to form a secondary line of defense. Behind his brigade were 1 million men of French and British nationality, who were advancing along with them. The Allies had come in force to seize Luxembourg, and they refused to leave without significant gains against the German borders. The general placed in command of the Western Front was a man Bruno would instantly recognize from history, even if he had not personally interacted with him much over the course of the last few years. Paul von Hindenburg was a highly decorated general feldmarschall within the German army, and was naturally given command over the defense of the German borders which they shared with France. He was also the man who had plotted the downfall of the Allied army group, which was pushing into Luxembourg. In fact, it was a rather devious plot if one really thought about it. One which he suspected the Allies who were desperate for a major victory would entirely overlook, and would only discover after it was already too late. As previously discussed, the border with Luxembourg and France was a specifically designed failure point, as only a few kilometers of it were actually shared with the French Republic. The rest of Luxembourg's western border was along the German Reich and Belgium's borders. But this small gap was all that was needed for the French to pierce through and hopefully create an entry point which they could then spread out into Belgium and Alsace-Lothringen. Such was their aim with this offensive. However, there was also another outcome, one which the Allies in their desperation would not possibly think of, and that was the fact that German forces waiting on the Belgian and Alsace-Lothringen borders would stand idly by and let the Allied army reach the borders of the Prussian Rhine province. And once they had done so, envelop around them, cutting them off from support from Allied territory in France. Once surrounded, they would be annihilated by the German forces on the Western Front. Sometimes history's most common and simple tactics were also the most effective. And like Hannibal had done to Rome at Cannae, so too did Paul von Hindenburg hope to achieve against the British and French in Luxembourg. Thus he had a haughty expression on his face as he voiced his well-conceived plan aloud to his subordinates, while also making a remark about Bruno's infamy, and marched to the Bosphorus as if it would pale in comparison to his own feat here on the West. Experience tales at Freeweb novel. That boy only knows how to bully those weaker than himself. The Wolf of Prussia? An unearned moniker if you were to ask me. Here I will crush the true rivals of Germany, and after I have sent this army to hell, I will seize Paris and end the war before he ever steps foot in the Alps. The officer directly beneath Hindenburg's command could only sigh and shake his head. There was a very simple way for the Allied powers to avoid annihilation entirely, and that was to simply not walk into this trap that had been sprung for them. Whether or not anybody in the British and French armies had enough common sense to pull off such a simple counter, however, remained to be seen. Chapter 313. The Point of No Return. History was filled with simplistic tactics during a time of war that, when observing with a rational mind, one might not believe had any chance of possibly succeeding. And if one were purely logical and rational, this would indeed be the result 100 out of 100 times. But most of the time a plan that was perfectly conceived and perfectly thought through failed not because there was faulty logic within the plot itself, but because of the execution of said scheme. Why was execution usually the failing point? Because unlike everything else involved, whether that be the logistics, strategy, or tactics prepared in advance, it was ultimately the execution that was prone to the most severe and often overlooked critical mistake. Human error. Those two words, when combined together in sequence, described something that could even further be simplified by the term stupidity. In this world, as a human, you were forced to interact with other people, whether directly or indirectly. Nothing existed in a vacuum with you alone. And because other people existed and were prone to being stupid, one would need to factor this into their plans if they wanted to guarantee success. Why do I mention human stupidity? Well, because certain tactics on the battlefield that proved successful time and time again would never be achieved without that very thing. For example, the feigned retreat, a tactic which the Mongols almost exclusively used on the field to obtain victory, had only worked because every time they attempted it, their enemies chose to pursue them, rather than simply stand still in their fortified position. It was very simple not to fall prey to the feigned retreat. When the enemy breaks ranks and flees, do not pursue them, rather fortify your own position so that you are in a better position for their next attack. War was a long and drawn-out affair. Seldom in history was an army capable of obliterating another army to the last man. That is why it was an accomplishment that was usually awarded with the most exceptional of decorations or other forms of prizes. Likewise, the double envelopment was another such strategy. If one simply was aware of their surroundings as they should be at all times and advanced at a reasonably paced, in line with their own reinforcements, then it was impossible to fall prey to its devastating effects. And that is ultimately the crux of this essay. Paul von Hindenburg's grand strategy to annihilate the Allies in Luxembourg relied upon nobody within the chain of command proposing the idea that maybe, just maybe, it was a bad idea to advance into an area where they could easily be surrounded and fired upon from all sides by an army of equal, if not greater size, and one that was technologically superior at that. But the Allies were desperate for a win of sizable fortitude, one that could convince the people back home in their nations that this war was worth continuing. Losses were colossal for the Allies. Millions were already injured, and hundreds of thousands lie dead, if not 1 million in total. Hell, France alone had thrown enough men at the German fortifications that they could easily have 1 million dead. Meanwhile, German casualties were maybe 1/10 in total of the Allies as a whole, and the Central Powers were perhaps 1/5. As the Austro-Hungarians and Russians were far less advanced than the German army, and likewise had less capable leadership. But it was not like the Allied powers were so incompetent that nobody saw that this was a potentially disastrous situation that they were walking into. In fact, one man of note had already predicted this was going to end with horrific consequences for the Allies. And because of this, he had secretly dispatched a runner to inform the head of the French army that the general in charge of the invasion was about to make an enormous mistake of epic proportions. The runner, perhaps channeling the spirit of Pheidippides, ran a distance of over 300 kilometers in the span of 72 hours. After all, the Allied army was primarily marching on foot and with horse-drawn carriages to support the munitions necessary for their assault. It would take them over a week to arrive at the border of Luxembourg and Germany, where the Germans had appeared to have retreated to. But with a dedicated ultramarathon runner traveling non-stop over the course of 3 days, he could make it to Paris in time, assuming he took time out of his day to properly rehydrate, eat, and take care of other bodily needs. And arrive in Paris the man did, exhausted and on the brink of death, as he forced his way into the headquarters of the French army's general staff, much to the outcry of those inside and the men who guarded their private office. The French High Command stood with their British advisors in Paris. Word of their impending victory had reached their ears. Assurances were given to them by the general in charge of the invasion force that at every encounter the Germans had fled. Only a few small-scale battles had taken place, and though losses for the Allies were quite high, or at least relative to what one would normally undertake in such an effort, they were much lower than previous attempts to defeat the Germans in battle. Hence, the Allied leadership was already celebrating what they thought would be a grand success, drinking wine and snacking on cheese as they made their comments. With the Wolf of Prussia tied up in the Balkans, it would appear the German army has been properly defanged. Our victory is absolutely certain. Luxembourg will fall, and from there we can advance into Alsace-Lorraine and seize control over our lands that have been stolen from us for far, far too long. The sentiment was shared by the others in the room, until loud shouting from outside the door interrupted their celebrations, causing them to frown. One of the British generals was quick to turn to the ongoing commotion and inquire about what was happening just outside their office. What in the devil is going on out there? With this said, the door burst open, as a French soldier in absolutely horrid state held up a letter that had been coated in his own sweat, forcing it up so that the men would notice. I am here on behalf of Colonel Charles de Gaulle. He has entrusted me with this letter to be given to Commander-in-Chief Joseph Joffre and him alone. Please, it is urgent. The French chief of staff quickly stood up and approached the enlisted soldier and grabbed hold of the letter, and upon reading the words contained within it, instantly began cursing up a storm. Damned fool, so eager for victory that you don't see you have entered the jaws of a ravenous tiger lying in wait for you. Call off the assault at once. We must not advance past the city of Luxembourg, not until we can confirm what the Germans are rally plotting. This news was shocking to say the least, and no doubt soured the mood in the room. But nobody dared to question the man in charge of the Allied forces at the Western Front. And thus telegraphs were sent out, and calls were made, desperately trying to stop the advance before they moved beyond the point of no return. Chapter 314. Anticipating Everything. Bruno sat in his temporary study within Brand Castle. While operations were going on within Luxembourg that had the potential to change the course of the war permanently, he was busy overseeing his daily tasks required with ruling over Transylvania. doing his best to overhaul everything he could so that the people of Transylvania would be in a better place after his reign came to an end than they were when he received it. Ideally, that should be the goal of every monarch. Create a better country than you received from your parents. But humans were flawed, deeply flawed, one might add. And it was because of this that even the best of intentioned human beings often found themselves being led astray from their initial ambitions and ultimately losing sight of the greater picture. But Bruno was a man free from such temptations. He had, after all, already suffered in death. He was on his second life, and he knew what the future held in store for humanity. He was far more afraid of dying before he could restore the weave of fate to this world than he was of death itself. And thus, mortal temptations that would otherwise lead other monarchs astray held no power over him. He was a man dedicated to the greater picture. And because of this, his mentality was never flawed. Frankly speaking, Transylvania had not been his responsibility nor concern. That is until it was bequeathed to him and his family by the Austro-Hungarian emperor as more or less their own personal fiefdom. The moment that occurred, he had every much of an obligation to the nearly 8 million people who lived in Transylvania, as he did the tens of millions who resided within the German Reich. Thus, he adopted the mentality that he believed monarchs ought to have when ruling over Transylvania, no matter how long the reign of his house over its lands may be. It could theoretically last until the end of the war. It could last a few decades until when Austro-Hungary inevitably collapsed on the weight of itself. Or it could last centuries. Either way, all he could really do was try to improve what already existed and build anew what he could with the time he was given, however long that may be. Thus he was hard at work, free from the worries and stress of what was otherwise happening within the world, and especially its ongoing Great War. After all, communicating with a man who was living a far more primitive lifestyle was difficult to say the least. Actual letters needed to be delivered to him by hand and returned to the sender with one of his own. Hence why he did not learn of Paul von Hindenburg's plans until Heidi entered the room and handed him the letter from the local postman. This has been addressed to you with some urgency from your friend Heinrich. I believe it would be wise to open it sooner rather than later, my love. Bruno nodded his head and thanked his wife before dismissing her. And once she had closed the door behind her exit, he pulled out his boot knife, which was his own Pathfinder knife from the days as the commander of the Iron Division, where he was quick to use its edge as a letter opener. Once doing this, Bruno read the contents, which revealed what the overall strategy was on the Western Front, and how Paul von Hindenburg sought to end the war here and now. And after doing so, he lit the letter aflame, not wanting any record of the communication. Not because it was particularly illegal or damning of any kind, but rather because he did not wish for the record of their correspondence to be uncovered and the intelligence contained within to be utilized against the German army. Bruno's own expression was stoic and nothing more. What Paul von Hindenburg planned to do was none of his concern, because he knew it would ultimately fail to achieve its goals. After all, Bruno had been keeping his eyes on many key players of the conflict, and the next one that should occur a mere 21 years after this current war concluded. He knew all too well of Charles de Gaulle's escape from the prisoner of war camp, and he also knew that the man had climbed the ranks of the French army rather quickly and was now stationed within the unit that was invading Luxembourg. That was a man with enough common sense to see a trap when it sprung itself before him. And because of this, Bruno knew the man would go to whatever lengths he could to prevent his allies from being played by Hindenburg. There was about a 10% chance that the allies were encircled and obliterated as Hindenburg planned, but it was far more likely that they would stop and hold Luxembourg with their new armored vehicles. This was something that could prove some difficulty to the German forces stationed in the region when it came to recapturing what Hindenburg had voluntarily given up for his schemes made in the vain pursuit of glory. In fact, Bruno estimated that there was a 60–70% chance that when the Kaiser realized that they would once more have to shed blood retaking Luxembourg, and significantly more than before, Paul von Hindenburg would at the very least suffer some form of public humiliation, if not disgraced entirely. And that would ultimately be the price he paid for trying to one-up Bruno and make him look bad in front of his peers. Because of this, Bruno simply shook his head and commented on his thoughts aloud, knowing that nobody was nearby to hear them. Fucking idiots. Why do they always think they know better than I? After saying this, he He went right back to signing his name on another document that he had just read over prior to the interruption he just now endured. After all, work called, and there was no rest for a man with a vision for the future. Chapter 3:15, Memento Mori. In a rather anachronistic display, banners were placed around the entry gates of Castle Brand, banners which bore the new coat of arms of House von Zehntner-Siebenbergen, which was the cadet branch that Bruno was now the official head of. He had, after all, been born the ninth son of a junker from Prussia, but here in Transylvania Bruno was a grand prince. It was only natural a cadet branch was formed to properly distinguish the two houses from one another. And as was per tradition, the new coat of arms included elements from the previous one, that being his family's eagle heraldry, and its colors waved brilliantly with the spring wind. Bruno found these days to be rather peaceful. No war, no bloodshed, no chemical gas, or endless sounds of death and despair to keep him awake in the dead of night. All that remained was peace and a quaint old town that was almost something straight out of a fantasy game. But these peaceful days did not last long. As soon enough, he received an official summons from the German army. He was to report to Berlin so that the 8th Army could properly mobilize and begin its assault within the Alps. General Feldmarschall Paul von Hindenburg's plans had resulted in a failure. The city of Luxembourg was not only seized by the Allies, but its boundaries were fortified with the latest weapons the Allies had designed to combat German advances, resulting in, for the time being, a stalemate, as the Western Front deemed taking back what had been lost in this disaster of a failed strategy too costly to bear for the time being. After all, there was no reason to be hasty and push the Allies out of Luxembourg when they themselves were not continuing with their advance. With this in mind, Paul von Hindenburg was called back to Berlin to be thoroughly chastised by his superiors for what he had done, while August von Mackensen was relocated from the Alpine Theater to the Western Front as its new commander. It was an honor he did not desire, as he personally wanted to witness Bruno's machines of war tear through the Italian fortifications like heavy cavalry would have done in the preceding century. But that was not his fate. Instead, he would watch the defenses in the West, while Bruno once more went on the offensive. And by all means, by the time Bruno arrived in Berlin to regroup with his men, the only thing that had not yet been transported to Tyrolean Alps were the men who would be fighting the war. All of their equipment was already waiting for them in Austria for the push south to reclaim land that had been taken from them a year prior during the winter offensive of 1914 that lasted briefly, but resulted in the largest gains the Allies had made to date. He was not surprised to see that Erich had not been present for this meeting of soldiers. He was, after all, currently engaging in a covert operation that would take months, if not years, to fully complete. Officially speaking, Erich was present with the army, even if he had resumed his position as Bruno's personal aide. And with the chaos of the war, nobody would ever realize that Erich simply wasn't with the army if Bruno said he had seen the man running about and had asked him to perform any number of errands for him, should someone inquire about the location of his mad dog. It was for this reason that Heinrich thought nothing of the man's absence, and instead was quick to comment on how he perceived the upcoming theater would unravel. Is it just me? Or is this the first time that you and I are actually fighting against a great power? Bruno was quick to remind Heinrich that they had briefly taken part in a war against a great power before, one that many people had forgotten about as it had occurred on the other side of the world. Is your memory so short that you forgot about our time in Manchuria? We fought the Russians there, didn't we? Even if it was officially in an advisory capacity, the Russian Empire is still a great power of this world, no? After reflecting on this for no more than 5 seconds, Heinrich was quick to deny Bruno's claims as the man himself had spoken them with the caveat of acting in an advisory capacity to a foreign power. Yeah, but we were just advisors there. Sure, you found yourself doing something stupid at Port Arthur, but that victory was not ours. We were not in operational control. Even the Japanese emperor rewarded you for it. I'm talking about, here and now, we are actually in command of a theater of operation against a great power. Sure, they are the least of the great powers, but a great power no less. Bruno could see Heinrich wanted to prove himself, perhaps feeling a bit underappreciated when compared to what Bruno had achieved in this life, despite them both graduating from the same class at the academy all those decades before. And with this in mind, Bruno was quick to make a wager to Heinrich while laughing about his poor self-worth. If you really think that doesn't count, then how about I let you lead the vanguard? What do you say? If you achieve a great victory worthy of remembrance, I will promote you to General Major and give you control of your own division. How does that sound? Frankly speaking, Heinrich's own accomplishments in his military career were as great as any other general major who currently held the rank. He was even granted the Iron Cross second and first class, as well as the Knight's Cross with swords of the Royal House Order of Hohenzollern with swords, meaning he himself was just one major achievement away from being granted the poor Lummerite himself. The primary reason Heinrich had yet to establish himself as a bona fide general was because of his young age. It was incredibly unusual for even the lowest-ranking generals to be in their mid-30s. Bruno was the exception in this regard, having achieved an unprecedented rise to power within the German military as a result of his repeated major strategic and tactical victories. Perhaps because it was an opportunity to prove himself and gain a much-desired promotion above the position he had been sitting at for years now. Heinrich was quick to agree to Bruno's terms, and with an almost too eager smile on his face. "You're on. I'll smash through the Italian defenses with ease. With the latest restructuring of the 8th Army, giving me control of 6 battalion tactical groups will be more than enough to obliterate the enemy to the last man." Bruno could tell he had sparked Heinrich's eagerness to fight this battle, but even so, he could not help but sigh and shake his head before reminding the man of a lesson that was ever present throughout human history despite commonly being ignored. Listen, Heinrich, never underestimate your enemy, even if the given chances of success seem absolutely certain. Overeagerness and a gross dismissal of the enemy's capabilities in the field has led to more disastrous losses in history than just about anything else, except for perhaps a lack of preparedness for the battle being fought. Promise me that you will keep this in mind when you make your assault. I don't want the expense I have paid in bringing the 8th Army into the era of modern warfare to go to complete and utter waste because you thought yourself invincible. Heinrich seemed to have understood Bruno's meaning, but still appeared somewhat dismissal and flippant in his response as he tried to assure Bruno that nothing of the sorts would befall him. What do I look like, an idiot? I know better than to underestimate the enemy. I'm just not sure what kind of weaponry they could possibly possess that could bring them victory given what they are going up against. This remark only caused Bruno to double down as he grabbed his friend's shoulder and stared him straight in the eye with a grim look on his face. It was almost as if he was speaking to himself through the reflection in Heinrich's irises as he did so. "I'm serious, you foolish bastard. You are only human. Death comes for us all, and often when we least expect it. Nothing is certain in this world. And just because our weapons are more advanced than what the enemy possesses does not mean for 1 second that we are impervious to their munitions. We are not gods, Heinrich. We are men, mortal men of flesh and bone, and the flesh is so easily brought to ruin. Promise me that you will heed my warning before marching headfirst into the enemy overconfident and overeager for victory, because if not, I will give the command to someone else right now." Heinrich had no words to say in response to this. Bruno had given him a painful reminder of the very real possibility of death while he was riding the high from their repeated success against the enemy in the field. A memento mori, so to speak, and because of this, he was quick to take a deep breath and reflect on his previous notions, after which he could only respond with a dejected tone in his voice. "I understand. I will take on this task you have given me with the seriousness that it is required. I apologize for my rashness. You are correct." With this said, Bruno began to realize that there might be a serious issue within the ranks of the German army, a sense of indomitability, one that, if not addressed swiftly, could have catastrophic effects on the war effort. Chapter 316, Advancing into Italy Part 1. Bruno had taken an armored train to the Alps, more specifically the Tyrolean Alps, along with the men beneath his command. And while this was happening, his wife was at the family estate, gazing out the window of the villa's library, with a book in her hands and a deeply complex expression on her angelic face. The book was nothing of note, nor was she really paying attention to the details contained within. Rather, she was gazing out at the spring rain as it fell upon the palace gardens, bringing life to all that lived within it. Whether that be the myriad of flowers and trees which soaked up the mist which caressed their leaves, roots, and petals, or the insects within the yard that used this beautiful time of year to propagate. The seasonal storms did not cast a gloomy shadow on the Berlin landscape, as one might expect it to. Nor did Heidi perceive it in this way. This was not a storm that foreshadowed a coming darkness. Rather, the rays of light protruding through the end of the storm, which could be witnessed in the distance, acted as a hope for a much greater tomorrow. It was perhaps because of this peculiar sight, which Heidi could not shift her eyes away from, that the woman felt a sense of ease and comfort. But as the heaviest part of the storm and its blackened clouds rapidly approached her, she suddenly felt a deep sense of despair. She could not understand the feeling of dread she was overcome by in that moment, but she knew, before the light of the morrow arrived, things would only get worse for everyone. And because of this, she grieved the loss of all those deaths and injuries that were to come in the following days. Heidi made a silent prayer in her heart for those who would fall before the bright future which awaited them all finally revealed itself, before ultimately shutting the windows and closing the shades, where she decided to get back to her book and escape to a land of fantasy far away from the troubles that were quickly encroaching upon her. Bruno sat in a compartment of the armored train which was taking him to the Alps. Sitting beside him were several of the lower-ranked generals beneath his command who were current leaders of the corps, divisions, and brigades within the roughly 80,000 men or so that now formed the German Eighth Army. His army had been more or less restructured into combined arms battalions, similar to the way a Russian battalion tactical group operated in the 21st century. These battalion tactical groups composed of 136 armored vehicles and 800 men each. Of these armored vehicles, 40 were designed for frontline combat, those being 10 Panzer I tank and 30 half-tracks. These half-tracks, which operated as mechanized infantry, were split into two distinctive models. The first model of half-track had a closed and fully armored passenger bay, with a hatch on top that allowed a gunner to pop his head out and fire an MG-34 behind a gun shield. It was more or less a primitive armored personnel carrier. The troops in the back would open up the rear doors and pile out 2 by 2. It was a fairly simple design, one that would more or less stand up against any small arms the enemy had, although it was relatively untested against anything more substantial, which the Allies might bear against it. There were about 20 of these half-track APCs among the German Eighth Army. However, the second model, there were as many of them as there were Panzer I tank, and that was 10. These were the same closed half-track design, but instead of a closable hatch and an MG-34 gun shield, the vehicle had a functional turret with a 20mm autocannon as its primary gun. Its secondary weapon was a coaxially mounted MG-34, more or less making this half-track a crude and primitive infantry fighting vehicle, or at the very least, fulfilling such a role. The rest of the 800 men not involved in these 4 companies were composed of support units, whether that came in the form of mechanized artillery, mechanized anti-aircraft, mechanized anti-armor, engineering companies, medical companies, reconnaissance companies, or even command structure. Everyone had an armored vehicle variant to make use of. These battalion tactical groups would combine to form brigade-sized units, which would in turn combine to form division-sized units, and finally corps-sized units. All in all, there were about 100 battalion combat teams within the German Eighth Army, or about 80,000 men. It had taken the Germans years of manufacturing armored vehicles and experimenting with variations to get to this point. But this was in all reality the first modern combined arms army the world had ever known, and it was headed to the Alps at this moment. Sure, they had months to get accustomed to their new units, tactics, equipment, etc. But currently Bruno was sitting in his compartment with his highest-ranking officers, speaking of the overall battle plan for their invasion of the Alps. After all, they would be going into a highly mountainous region, one where the advantage of using armor on an open field was negated. Because of this, Bruno's strategy was a slow and steady pace, which he outlined on the map, more specifically at a curious and small town within the Tyrolean province of Austria. Thanks to the failures of our Austrian allies, the fortifications we prepared in southern Trient in advance for this war have fallen to the hands of the Italians. As a result, the entirety of the region has fallen under their control, forcing us to draw a new line of defense in South Tyrol on its border with Trient, the result of which has been well over a year of bitter fighting between our forces in the Alps and the enemy. But luckily we have managed to maintain the lines of conflict as they have been since the initial blunder in 1914. And because of this, we will be moving the 8th Army from the city of Bozen to where the enemy's defenses are thickest directly north of Trient. After all, they are anticipating us attacking from a weak point. But they would never expect a head-on collision at their most reinforced fortification. The might of our 75mm and 105mm self-propelled artillery, supported by German and Austro-Hungarian heavier artillery, will breach the Italian fortifications with ease, of which our tanks and half-tracks will pour through the gap like a tidal wave of steel. The aim is to completely and totally crush their most veteran units and push south before they can mobilize proper reinforcements. As for the rest of the border, it will be assaulted by the Alpenkorps and the Austro-Hungarian army after we have already broken through the thickest line of defense. To put it simply, for the sake of this theater, we are the tip of the spearhead to drive through the links in the enemy's mail armor. That is our sole goal, and we will conduct ourselves with the ferocity and aggression we have all become known for over the last year and a half. Is that understood? There was no disagreement from among the ranks. And because of this, Bruno was capable of nodding his head once he had a unanimous consensus on the battle plan, after which he was quick to comment on the situation overall. Very well then, you all know your orders. The train should be arriving at our destination any minute now. It is your job to convey through the chain of command that our march won't stop until the Trient as a whole has returned to its rightful rulers. Until the moment we arrive, however, take this moment to have a smoke, and whatever else you may need to relax without becoming impaired, because this might be your last moment to do so before this day is over. After saying this, Bruno stood up and approached the bar, where he ordered a coffee to keep his mind sharp for the battle that was about to begin. Naturally, as the general in charge of the entire army, he would be at the very rear, supported by AT and AA elements with the rest of the chain of command. But even so, he couldn't shake the feeling that this new theater of warfare was going to present challenges and difficulties that he had not properly perceived and thought through. Either way, he could not dwell on these thoughts long, for within the span of 10 minutes the train arrived at its destination, where Bruno helped take part in getting the equipment off the cars and into the streets where they would begin their assault at the earliest given opportunity. Truly on this day, of April 22nd, 1916, the German spring offensive had begun, and with it came a new era of warfare which nobody could have possibly anticipated. Chapter 317. Advancing into Italy Part 2. Heinrich sat in the back of a half-track. The armored vehicle which he sat in was in the rear of the formation, along with the other command vehicles. It was a specialized half-track that made use of an armored compartment and advanced radio equipment. Its singular purpose was to convey orders to the rest of the battalion tactical group and maintain operational control over the battlefield. He was also more than capable of coordinating with other battalions, as well as aerial assets, which were in the area. The engines of 40 armored vehicles within the battalion growled in tandem as tanks, and half-tracks drove across the winding mountain pass, which led to the strongest point in the Italians' defenses at Trient. All the while, self-propelled anti-aircraft guns and anti-tank guns were mixed in the column, providing protection for the many armored vehicles from whatever threats may potentially present themselves. The Spags themselves came in two different configurations, one with a quad-mounted 2 cm flak gun mounted to the chassis, and another with a single 37mm flak gun, which was able to create a large explosive blast and fire at higher altitudes. Heinrich himself sat in his seat, while listening to his headset, which was attached to the radio within his half-track. From the sound of it, his forces were closing in on the enemy's position, and the 1st Air Wing, which was attached to the 8th Army, was flying overhead. The light bomber variants of the He-51 were about to make contact with the enemy fortifications, and the men on top of the Spags mounted weapons were quick to cheer as they saw the German planes fly towards the fortifications embedded within the mountainside. A group of He-51s, which were painted with the typical camouflage pattern, were being led by a plane whose pilot was now infamous for his massive kill count. By now the Red Baron had scored a solid 100 kills in the sky, while he had also shot down 3 of the British tanks from above the Belgian front lines. Among the people of the German Reich, the name Manfred von Richthofen was renowned far and wide. while his infamous moniker was used with dread among those pilots within the Allied Flying Corps. The Red Baron led the charge from the sky, while Heinrich led the vanguard from the ground below. And for the Allied soldiers who waited in the fortifications, to hear the screaming howl of engines and the sight of endless tanks prowling through the mountain pass, it was truly like the gates of hell had opened before them. Especially after the German light bombers dropped their payloads on the heads of the Allied soldiers, who hid beneath their bunkers, hoping to wait out the storm of fire. But was this remotely possible? Because the moment the Italian soldiers and their allies hid beneath the complexes the Germans had built for their own defense in preparation for this war, the self-propelled artillery of the 75mm and 105mm variants began to open fire on them. In addition to this, the towed howitzers and mortars of the 150 and 211mm varieties. The explosives blast rocked the cliffside where the steel-reinforced concrete fortifications were battered time and again. With each passing second, a barrage was fired upon the Allies, or a bomb dropped from above. While at the same time the 1000 Panzer is within the German 8th Army opened fire with their 5cm semi-automatic guns, each of which fired the advanced Panzergranate 39 armor-piercing shells. While the artillery and bombers dropped explosive fire upon the fortifications, which slowly chipped away at the concrete bunkers, the 5cm shells, despite being of the smallest size, were the most effective. They were designed, after all, to penetrate through thick hardened steel armor. If one fired them on concrete fortifications, it was like punching a giant hole through dry wall with your fist. The result was devastating, and before the Allies even realized it, they had been exposed to the enemy fire. The Allies quickly began to panic as they realized the enemy was able to sit back over 1,000 meters away and bombard their position with impunity. Those who tried to get on their 2cm pom-pom Maxim guns, which were used for anti-air, as well as their own artillery, were quick to realize that they were the first devices to be targeted. Without superior firepower, they were effectively relying on small arms and a few hundred boys' anti-tank rifles and Blacker bombards which the British had brought with them when they deployed to the Italian Alps to help counter the 1916 spring offensive. However, there was just one problem. The effective range of these weapons was a few hundred meters at best. After that, any hope of penetrating armor became non-existent. Meanwhile, the Germans could sit back at 1,500 meters with their panzers, half-tracks, and other armored vehicles, firing upon the Allied position with complete and total impunity without having to worry the least about resistance. After all, the PZGR 39 fired out of a 5cm gun was capable of penetrating 37 mm of hardened rolled homogeneous steel armor at a distance of 1,500 meters. Explore more at Freeweb Novel, which was more than enough to continue chipping away at the fortifications built into the mountainside until nothing was left of it. And that was the plan. The Germans would sit back and bombard the ever-living hell out of the Allies until their concrete fortifications were rendered to ruin, and then they would roll over the rubble as if it had been nothing short of a minor inconvenience. And this is exactly what happened, as Heinrich reported back to Bruno that the first stage of their operation to advance into Trient and reclaim it for the Archduchy of Austria had been a monumental success. It appears you were right after all. The enemy does not have the means to reach us at this distance. Within the hour, these fortifications will be nothing more than scrap. Are you sure you want to do this? Did you not spend an exceptional sum of time and money building these to begin with? Bruno's voice followed over the wire. He sounded indifferent as he responded to the question with certainty. Since the Allies now possess them, it would be better to destroy what I have built than allow them to continue to make us of it. Burn it to the ground and march over its ashes. Kill everyone who stands in your path. We don't have the time to take prisoners. This was an order Heinrich expected from Bruno. After all, the man had a habit of ignoring surrenders and pretending like he was never given notice. In this day and age, it was hard to prove otherwise. And because of this, he could only sigh and shake his head as the echoes of battle continued to resound throughout the mountainous ravine where the battle was taking place. Chapter 318. Advancing into Italy Part 3. Smoke and Ruins. That was all that remained at the border between what the Italians had gained from their 1914 winter offensive and what Austria currently held. Well, smoke, ruins, and a metric shit ton of dead bodies. Under Bruno's orders, the Allied soldiers were fired upon without remorse or quarter. They had not even had a chance to razor the white flag and attempt to surrender because the overwhelming volume of fire they were under was enough to completely annihilate their forces. This was more or less how Bruno had expected this battle to be. His infantry only deployed from the backs of their armored vehicles and scaled into what remained of the Allied trenches after the gunfire had ceased. Find your adventure at Freeweb Novel. Their job was simply to confirm that the enemy was dead and to put anyone unfortunate enough to still be breathing out of their misery. When it came to warfare in the early 20th century, mobility was king. The faster one was able to mobilize the firepower they had available to them onto their targets, the better their chances of victory were. And Bruno just so happened to be extremely adept at commanding combined arms units. This was, after all, the standard format of 21st century units, and how warfare was supposed to be waged against a conventional force. The way Bruno saw it, his army was damn near unbeatable in the current era. To put it simply, even if the Allies had the means to damage or destroy his armored vehicles, which they were currently trying their best to figure out how to effectively do so, they lacked the means to rapidly transport them into play on the battlefield. Whereas Bruno could sweep past fortification after fortification before he ever met a foe capable of properly countering him. There was just one problem with this. He had the only combined arms field army in the world, meaning that he had to wait for his much slower allies to catch up to him in order to provide support. A field army was a sizable force, and when operating on a battlefield was hard to counter. But the enemy was using army groups on a massive scale to defend their territory. And despite the fact that he possessed superior firepower and mobility, if an entire army group were to withdraw to a singular line of defense to entrap him, there would be no fighting his way out of that mess. Because of this, Bruno never advanced beyond the support of his allies. After all, a single field army could not win a war by itself. Hence why, after taking the fortification at the border, where Allied forces had been their strongest, Bruno and his field army waited for their allies to do their jobs. It was a rather difficult position to be in. They had just turned the defensive line into a wasteland of rubble and debris. Meanwhile, it would probably be days, or even weeks, before news arrived on the wire of their allies having success with their own assaults. Because of this, Bruno ordered the armored units to form a line of defense, where the soldiers quickly got to work scavenging what they could while disposing of the corpses that lie hewn across the devastated landscape. All the while Bruno fancied himself a walk, as he got out of the back of his own armored vehicle and walked towards a rather noticeable ruin. Bruno quickly found himself standing upon what remained of that which he presumed to be the Allied command bunker. Within the ruins, he found the deceased remains of several Allied officers, including what appeared to be an Italian general. There was also a tattered Italian banner which Bruno found pierced by the pole it had clearly been flying upon prior to the assault. After grabbing the banner and ripping it off of the iron mast, he quickly unfolded it, revealing the flag of the Kingdom of Italy. However, unlike the Ottoman flag, Bruno did not set the Italian colors ablaze. Instead, he rolled it up nicely into a triangle and placed it neatly on the lap of the deceased Italian general. In doing so, Bruno said a silent prayer for the recently departed before speaking in near-flawless Italian, saying his apologies to the men he had laid to waste. Contrary to my reputation, I never wanted to be at odds with any of you. Had the war been avoidable, and we could have all lived peaceful lives with our wives and children, I would have preferred such a fate. Unfortunately, the powers that be decided that we must wage war against one another, and your bravery in the face of certain death has been most admirable to witness. You can rest easy, General, as I make this solemn vow to you. I promise that I will not lay Rome to waste, and will do everything in my power to preserve the history, culture, and architecture of your people as I march to your capital. The same cannot, however, be said for the men I encounter on the way there. After saying this, Bruno walked away from the corpses of the Allied commanders and returned to his own half-track, where he got on the radio and listened to the most recent reports. The invasion of Italy had just begun, and Bruno would not rest until Rome fell to his control. Even so, it was not like the Allies' plan to just wait for Bruno and his army to march into the Italian capital. No, They had already been alerted to the assault on their defenses and were preparing to withdraw their forces further inland to prepare a proper counterattack. This was despite the fact that Bruno's advance had come far sooner than expected and ended in victory almost immediately after the battle began. And while the Allies believed they could succeed in resisting his invasion, the soldiers feared that they would be facing an unprecedented number of armored vehicles. Their assumptions would indeed prove correct, as a tidal wave of steel was waiting to crash over them. Chapter 319, Pack 38s and Teller Mines. The war at the Italian border continued to push in the favor of the Central Powers. All the while fights were being had on the Western Front as the Allies began attacking positions other than the border with Germany shared with the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg. Alsace-Lothringen, seeing the first major action since the initial outbreak of the war, was hit hard and fast by Allied armor. All the while southern Belgium came under a similar onslaught. But the defenses were solid. In the case of the German fortifications, they had spent practically a decade reinforcing their lines of defense. Discover stories at Freeweb Novel. While the Belgians had been undergoing an extensive process over the course of the last year. Even so, after 2 years of repeated Allied charges, the most terrifying aspect of the German defenses, the S-mines embedded within no man's land, had become close to depleted. Bodies after bodies had activated these mines over the course of the last 2 years, and by now it was a far more rare occurrence for the explosive fondly nicknamed the Bouncing Betty by Americans during Bruno's past life to actually propel itself into the air and detonate when the French and British launched an assault. Even so, it was not so rare that it was entirely unheard of. Thousands, if not tens of thousands of mines were still dug beneath the soil of every 10 kilometers worth of borderlands. And because of this, Allied forces who were what one might call willing participants of a charge were few and far between. Perhaps it was naivety on the part of the Allies, or maybe overconfidence. But when their troops became too frightened to advance among the repeated detonations of anti-personnel mines, the commander in charge of the army advanced towards Alsace-Lothringen, gave the order to move forward with tanks. A strategy which, while good on paper, failed to take into account one critical piece of information that the Allies were missing. And that was the fact that the Germans had long since prepared for such an eventuality when building their defenses. Especially over the course of the last year, when the introduction of Allied armored vehicles became a very real concern to counter. Because of this, as the Mk2 tanks advanced over the landmine and barbed wire-riddled no man's land, they encountered an undesirable surprise waiting in store for them. A gunner aimed down the sights of the Pack 38 anti-tank gun. The loader had already made sure that a fresh 5 cm Panzergranate 39 shell was loaded in the chamber when the roar of the Allied tanks' engines became apparent. The efficiency of German production lines truly shocked Bruno, as his arms corporations had produced more barrels for 5 cm anti-tank guns than he had tank chassis to strap them on. As a result, he had ensured that the German fortifications on the Western Front were well equipped with the wheeled variant of the weapon that was more of a static weapon emplacement than the version mounted as the primary weapon on his Panzer is. And this gun was one of many within the border of Alsace-Lothringen, which was perhaps overly fortified as a giant middle finger to the French. Yet as the gunner took aim at the oncoming tanks, without the slightest dread or anxiety on his face, he noticed something exceptional happen. The first tank to cross over the boundaries of the minefield that lied between the borders of Germany and France immediately self-destructed, causing mass panic among the lines of French tanks. Not that any of them had radios within their vehicles and were thus not able to effectively communicate with one another. In fact, it was not only the tanks that were panicking as they continued to randomly combust as they pushed forward as a column, but the infantry behind them as well. Why were their tanks suddenly exploding when not a single shell appeared to impact upon their armored plating? The answer to this was truly sinister. Because beneath the surface of the earth, buried along with the many S-mines that the myriad of infantry had already triggered, were also as many anti-tank mines of the Teller Mine 43 variety. You see, an anti-tank mine needed a certain poundage of pressure to activate, one which a mere man could not detonate by his lonesome. And the Allied soldiers who had marched through tens of thousands of S-mines, using their lives to clear them in the process, had also unwittingly stepped on these anti-tank mines. which were simply waiting day after day, week after week, month after month, and year after year for something extremely heavy like an Allied tank to step on them. And when they did, boom, it was a rather terrifying thing for the Allied troops to witness, as they thought that these armored vehicles would be the shield of their advance. Only for them to suddenly explode, the shrapnel and cook-off of rounds causing far more damage to the infantry behind them than the enemy was capable of doing. Not to say that the German defenders had not done substantial damage on their own. The introduction of the 7.92 by 57 mm Fedorov Avtomat rifle and the extensive amount of lead it was able to send down range had most definitely enhanced the capabilities of the German infantry and the degree of bodies they could stack with it. At the same time, the Pak-38s embedded in the trenches began to understand what was happening and opened fire among the chaos. Their armor-piercing 50 mm shells flying down range and penetrating the thin riveted steel hulls of the Allied Mk2 tanks, exploding only after they had entered the vehicle's interior and killing the crew in the process. They also managed to ignite the fuel and ammunition contained within the tanks, prompting them to explode horrifically as they did so. The most unlucky of Mk2 saw their turrets fly sky high into the air, as if one were tossing a frisbee to God in heaven above. Needless to say, as the battle waged on, Germany continued to hold Alsace-Lothringen with little challenge to their rightful claim over the region. And as the French tried desperately to fight for their own misguided ambitions, thousands of their men died for what ultimately resulted in a horrific tactical defeat. Chapter 320. The Prince and His Common Fiancée. Erwin's life at the military school was far from special. At school, he was not treated with any regard for who his father was, or the accomplishments of his extended family had during the ongoing war. No, he was just another cadet. One through his sheer intelligence, will, merit, and charisma found himself today being promoted within the ranks. As was tradition, cadets had their own ranking system, one that fostered a sense of familiarity with the military command structure whose binding rules they would one day all be living under. Previously, Erwin had been a cadet sergeant, but today he was being promoted to a cadet staff sergeant, or in the German language Weissfeldwebel. More or less, he was the assistant sergeant to a platoon leader. The thing is, these ranks had no real authority outside of the academy, or more specifically the cadets within it. Yet it was a sign of his ability to perform with exception, as others whose tenure in the school was much longer than Erwin's had yet to reach such a rank. In fact, the academy was much like the German military based upon merit and one's willingness to perform above and beyond their peers. In this regard, Erwin had filled his day-to-day outside of mandatory schooling and other tasks with voluntary assignments, learning things like field craft, basic survival techniques, mountaineering, etc. And for each of these things which he excelled at, the boy was granted another chance at a promotion above his peers. Striving for excellence had become Erwin's goal at the academy. He did not just wish to graduate at the position of a commissioned officer when the time arrived for him to do so. No, Erwin wanted to be known for his exemplary conduct and skills as an officer candidate, one which would not be overshadowed as by his father's legacy. And because of this, he had quite the proud smile on his face as his uniform was updated by the actual adult military officer who was in charge of his class. The officer was quick to salute Erwin after attaching the rank insignia to his shoulder tabs, and after doing so, he spoke to the boy with an almost proud tone in his voice. He was an older man, in his late 50s, rapidly closing in on his 60s. In fact, he was remarkably similar to the age Bruno had been in his past life before reaching his untimely end on that fateful day in Hamburg. The man's wrinkled face showed signs of combat experience, but from ages ago. And it was perhaps with this in mind that he was quick to say something that Erwin was not expecting. I was not expecting your father to send you here. After all, he was the only one of his generation which I was not able to teach within these hallowed halls. And to my surprise, he became the most exceptional of them all. I won't lie. It gives me a great sense of pride to correct that mistake by ensuring that his son is raised to be an exceptional officer within His Majesty's Kaiser Wilhelm Army. Explore stories on freewebnovel.com. Even so, despite your heritage and the line of warriors you descend from, boy, remember that the only way you will ever succeed in living up to the expectations this academy and the army has for you as if you work twice as hard as those who came before you. You understand me, right, boy? Erwin obviously returned the instructor's salute and confirmed he understood exactly what the man was saying with a silent nod of his head. And when the instructor understood this, he was quick to smirk before walking off without saying another word. Naturally, Erwin would double down on his efforts to rise to the top of the academy by his own will and ability, and in doing so, become a trailblazer for the next generation of German soldiers. While Erwin was attending Prussia's foremost military boarding school for the youth, his fiancée, Alia, was at a diner with some friends. They were all more or less the same age as her and had gone to school together with her. She was the adopted daughter of a family of wealthy merchants. And because of this, these noble ladies who gathered around her were of a far higher social status. Even so, they did not treat her any lesser than they would their own sisters. Why was this? Because Alia had the esteemed status as being Bruno's goddaughter. Bruno was an interesting figure, one of much social commentary. He was a man who was already spoken about as a near-mythical figure. From his military victories, to his Prince Charming-like appearance, to his extraordinarily humble attitude. Time and again, Bruno had been uplifted by the allies of the Reich to a rather exceptional position of nobility. And yet, his loyalties forever lied within the boundaries of the German Reich and to its rightful monarch. Interestingly enough, Bruno had exemplified and immortalized this sense of loyalty to Germany and its people with the motto he gave to his family, or more specifically his cadet branch that ruled over the Grand Principality of Transylvania. It was a motto ripped straight from one of the most abominable organizations in his past life, but also one of the most admirable. Controversial statement to be sure, but Bruno had to admit there was nobody better suited to the motto in history than the unit it belonged to. I'm talking, of course, about the words "Mein Ehre heißt true," which when translated to English roughly equated to the phrase "My honor is loyalty." This was the motto of the infamous Waffen-SS from Bruno's past life. The personal shock troops of the Nationalist Socialist German Workers' Party, and an organization of war criminals, some of which were among the most heinous offenders of the Second World War. And while there were other nations like the Soviet Union, the Empire of Japan, and of course the United States and Great Britain, who could contend for that title, none of them quite exemplified the degree of loyalty which the Waffen-SS had. Sure, when people think of fanatical loyalty, they think of the Imperial Japanese Army, and their refusal to surrender even in the face of certain death. But the Japanese ultimately surrendered when their emperor told them to. The Waffen-SS, however, were built of more solid steel. Many of their units fought until the death, days and even weeks after the death of their leader and the dissolution of their empire. Hell, the SS Charlemagne, who were French units, fought to the death in defense of the Führer bunker even after knowing everyone inside its depths had chosen the easy way out. While others chose to fight even their own comrades who turned against them, like at the Battle of Kassel Itter days later, rather than surrender to the enemy. With this in mind, and while considering all the horrific things the Waffen-SS had done, or at the very least been accused of doing, choosing to continue the fight to the bitter end in the name of loyalty to a lost cause, even as your leaders lie dead or imprisoned, and your empire has burned to ash, was a sentiment which Bruno could only find admirable. Hence why Bruno chose this motto to represent his house, as he too was loyal to the German Reich, and its Kaiser much in the same way the Waffen-SS was to their Führer. Because of this, Bruno's reputation was quite high within German society, one that not even the likes of the Kaiser or his ministers felt threatened by, despite the very large threat he posed to Germany should he prove disloyal. And Alia's ties to this man gave her exceptional status as a result. Hence why these highborn ladies considered her among their equals, even if she did not officially hold such a status. Nevertheless, these women were all married and had children of their own, while Alia, a woman who was roughly 20, was still engaged to her much younger fiancé, something that would have been normal in years past, but was far less common, and perhaps even scandalous in the modern era. This was the reason one of the ladies, engaging in friendly banter, broached the subject with Alia in a not-so-subtle way. "So tell me, Alia, how is that adorable little boy who you are set to marry in a decade faring? I could never be so courageous like you. The idea of kissing a small child and being openly flirtatious with him in public. It's simply brave." Alia Dam near choked on her coffee as she heard this backhanded comment about herself and Erwin. It was one thing to insult her for being tied to such an old-school betrothal, but to insult Erwin as well? She was already starting to lose her patience. And if she did, this highborn lady who had dared to provoke Alia's fury was about to receive the scolding of a lifetime. Chapter 321. Alia Fights Back. Alia was not pleased by the comment made at her expense and that of her future fiancé. It was one thing if these women wanted to make backhanded remarks to her face about her. That was, after all, a common occurrence among women no matter the era. But to make such a remark about Erwin, it was entirely uncalled for and grossly misrepresentative of their relationship. It was not like Alia had been given a choice in the engagement she found herself in. Her adopted father was a simpleton when it came to managing such affairs. He had, after all, been born the spoiled brat of a family of wealthy merchants who spent his entire adulthood up until the point where he ended up taking care of her being a good-for-nothing playboy. It was ultimately Heidi's decision to betroth her eldest son to her goddaughter. And while Alia may not have had a choice in the matter, she was not shameless enough to openly admit such a thing, let alone publicly denounce the boy she would one day marry when he came of age simply to get in the good graces of her friends. Friends whose social standing was in no way equivalent to Erwin's, let alone his father's. Because of this, she was quick to defend Erwin and remind these bitches just what position he had at the moment. I wouldn't make such backhanded remarks about the nature of my betrothal if I were you. You know that my fiancé's father has the love and ear of the Kaiser. Hell, after the recent blunder Hindenburg made, I would say my future father-in-law is on the fast track to becoming the next chief of staff and perhaps supreme commander of the entirety of the Central Powers. You should be aware of the rumors now, of how fierce the man can be to those he deems his enemies. I can personally attest that I have witnessed firsthand just what the Grand Prince is capable of, and would remind you that it would be in your best interest not to go around insulting the honor of his son, or God forbid, his wife, who he would move the world for. The subtle reminder that the highborn lady's remarks about Erwin and Alia's unusual betrothal was ultimately a slight against Heidi caused the pupils of all the noble ladies present to partake in this conversation to shrink down to the size of a pin. Bruno was a man who had massacred an entire city, and rumor had it he had done so because the Black Hand, and by extension the Serbian royal family, had targeted someone who had come to know Bruno in passing. Being the man he is, Bruno perceived this as a threat to his own family and decided to send his own message to the world at large. You come after my people, and I will burn the whole world to the ground if I have to. It was the reason he was known as the Butcher of Belgrade, within certain circles, a name that conjured the horrific image of a madman standing in front of a blazing city to all who heard it. Never mind the fact that he had gassed the city into extinction. Fire was, after all, a far more terrifying sight for most people to imagine within their own thoughts. And because of this, the woman who had started shit with Alia quickly looked towards their other friends for support in this matter, while they themselves averted their gazes, not willing to step on the toes of Alia and the family connections she had by sheer chance. Alia, of course, had a petty and sadistic smirk when she realized she had frightened her friend into properly behaving herself, and said nothing as she sipped from her tea. All the while the woman was quick to recant her prior remarks. I apologize if what I said came off as rude. I assure you, Alia, it was not my intent. It was clear by the look on the woman's face that she was properly shaken up, and while Alia was about to accept the apology, the other women in the group quickly realized that the pecking order had changed and used this opportunity to completely dismantle their friend for all the shit she had talked towards them over the years, with one of them going out of the way to reveal just why the woman had made such a remark. Don't be too harsh on her, Alia. You do understand that she herself is merely jealous of the relationship you have with your fiancé. She doesn't believe you are worthy of marrying the heir to the von Zehntner-Siebenbergen dynasty. How quickly news spread of Bruno's cadet branch, which now ruled over Transylvania, backward of a region, as it may be compared to Prussia and the city of Berlin. A grand prince was a grand prince, and that was something these women who were on the lower end of the upper nobility greatly desired to marry into. For example, the woman who had insulted Alia to her face with a backhanded compliment was a countess. But Alia would become a princess by virtue of marrying Erwin when he came of age. It simply enraged her, or at least in some subconscious way. Experience tales at freewebnovel.com. And the mere mention of this insecurity caused the woman to glower at her friends, who had used this opportunity to tear her down in order to build favor with the new queen bee of their group. But none of the other ladies felt threatened by her menacing glances, because Alia now had true power backing her, and that was something that none of these women or their families actually had. The wealth, prestige, and power that Bruno wielded was comparable to a Kaiser in his own right. And despite this, he wielded it not for himself, but for the House of Hohenzollern and the German Reich as a whole. Ultimately, at least in Germany, this was the reason the man was so beloved. And that was not going to change simply because a jealous young lady made a remark about his son and presumed heir's antiquated betrothal. Chapter 322. Conspiracy Averted. The Grand Fleet of the British Navy had taken substantial losses during the onset of the war, and as a result, the phrase "Britannia rules the waves" had not exactly been repeated in some time. No, it was an era of German dominance, on the seas, on the lands, and in the skies. And because of this, the British Navy had spent the last 2 years trying their darndest to come up with a solution to their current predicament. The mounting of QF-2 pounds pom-pom Maxims did little to help with this. Sure, the torpedoes launched by the He-51 seaplanes were a problem, but they could fly at high enough altitude to avoid 20mm rounds. And besides, that did not address the real problem with the damn near undetectable submarines which were lying in wait under the seas to attack British ships with Wolfpack tactics. How exactly did one counter an enemy that could be anywhere at any time, and you were not even remotely aware of their location? Well, you couldn't. And since Bruno had spent years acquiring the loyalty of brilliant minds who might be able to solve this problem for the British, by having them immigrate to the German Reich, where they were compensated extremely well for their efforts, there was little that could be done to restore Britannia's rule over the waves. So with the British Navy being relegated to almost exclusively the protection of shipping and transportation of troops from across the colonies, as the North Sea and the English Channel were now owned by the German Reich, the British government found itself in a precarious position. In fact, with little to show for their attempts to seize territory near Luxembourg, having failed to push into Alsace-Lothringen, and only having gained a mere 3 miles in exchange for 300,000 lives at Belgium's southern border. There were many within the higher echelons of both the military and civilian government that wanted to sue for peace while it was still an option. Because of this, a group of ministers, generals, and titans of industry within the British Empire were gathered in secret within London to discuss petitioning the king with their grievances. Of course, there were many within the British Empire who did not wish to lose this war, and were far more interested in it continuing for much longer. After all the chaos and disorder sown in Europe and the world at large as a result of this global conflict was something these shadowy multinational individuals and their secret cabal desperately wanted for their own myriad of reasons. But these men were not aware of these shadowy people who Bruno was actively combating behind the scenes, nor was he aware of their aspirations. Because of this, they were not privy to the knowledge that they were already being watched by those hidden behind the veil. Hence why they gathered together in one setting to discuss their ideas. And among these men was Admiral of the Fleet Rosalind Erskine Weems, who had become the first Sea Lord earlier this year. In Bruno's past life, this position would have been held by John Jellicoe, but he had been killed in action at the onset of the war during the first engagement between the British Grand Fleet and the German High Seas Fleet. Because of this, Rosalind Weems was now more or less in command of the British Navy, and after seeing his ships depleted one after another in this war, with little retaliation given in return for their sunk ships, and he was all but ready to throw in the towel. Even so, he appeared a bit shaken up and paranoid, even if one might believe such a thing. His voice gave such a sentiment away as well as he spoke, but only after looking around 3 dozen times to confirm he really was only among friends. If we are to petition the king to end this war, then we must do so swiftly. I swear I have been being watched recently. On the streets, at the office, and even within my own home. My own servants are plotting against me. I can tell. Someone is watching us. No, someone knows what we are planning, and they do not want us to go through with it. So it is now or never. Are we really doing this or not? Nobody else had noticed such strange behavior within their own lives, and all of them thought that the admiral was being paranoid and nothing more than that. However, to appease him, they were quick to voice their agreement. Very well, we will draft a declaration here and now to stand down and refuse to continue with the war in every way we can until the king and his cabinet officially pursue a dialogue for peace. In the next moment, there was a voice that echoed from the staircase above. They were after all gathered in the cellar of a pub. The voice did not sound friendly as it spoke in a rather mocking tone while continuing to step down the wooden stairwell. I'm afraid that is not an option, for none of you will be leaving this cellar alive. A man dressed in a trench coat and a mask stepped down the stairs with a pistol in his hand and a silencer attached to it. It was a Colt 1903, and he had pointed it at the men in question, who all stared in disbelief at the gunman who had found them. The admiral began to panic as he pointed at the intruder while damning his fellow conspirators for not listening to his words sooner. Damn you all. I told you weeks ago I was being followed. You see what your stubbornness has wrought for us all. The masked gunmen were quick to chuckle as he was about to pull the trigger of his weapon. That is until he felt the cold steel of another suppressed pistol pressed against his skull, along with a taunting phrase spoken in perfect German. Typical novice mistake, using a semi-automatic. Leaving behind casings is sloppy, don't you think? Sweat poured down the brow of the masked gunman as he realized there was someone right behind him. Someone whose face was not concealed in the slightest, revealing his sinister and sadistic smirk. The gunman only managed to get out one statement before his brains were blown out. The terror of Belgorod. Bang! A muffled gunshot could be heard by those within its immediate vicinity, all the while a splash of blood and gray matter preceded the fall of a fresh corpse. Upon seeing how terrified the men within the room were, Eric stashed his weapon away and raised his hands. Relax. If I wanted you all dead, you would have never made it to this little gathering of yours. You lot ought to be careful, though I wiped out more than one branch of the Rothschilds and those who share their ambitions. There are still more than a few vermin lurking around, and these rats do not want you to spoil their plans. So, here's how we're going to treat this. You are going to return to your families and pretend like none of this ever happened. You never saw me, and you never had any intentions of withdrawing from this war. Because you are all messing with powers far larger than you could possibly comprehend, and my master is not one of them. Go now, run along to your families. I'm sure they are waiting. There was no need to wait for another second. The men gathered within the room had left in a heartbeat, forgetting all about their plans to get Britain to sue for peace. After the men had fled the room, Eric was quick to scavenge the corpse of the agent he had just killed. He found a small book within the man's coat pocket. However, the title was smeared with blood and was virtually unreadable in its current state. Eric was quick to stash the book away after reading aloud what little he could comprehend. Discover stories with freewebnovel.com. The protocols of what now? What the hell did I just find? Whatever is, it's evidence. Which means I am sure the boss will want to get his hands on it as soon as possible. After saying this, Eric walked away and grabbed a nearby oil lantern which was used to light the small cellar. He quickly tossed the device onto the floor, which instantly sparked a flame, rapidly spreading fire everywhere and in doing so, consuming any evidence of his crimes. He then fled into the night, disappearing from the city of London as if he had never been there in the first place. Chapter 323: Eliminating Traitors. The Rothschilds had lost 2 branches of their family in as many months. The attack on their Austrian branch was a reprehensible crime, but after extensive investigation, they were led to believe it was instead an act of random violence, as the perpetrator had not left anything behind that could tie him to a greater conspiracy. In fact, Eric had concealed his involvement in the murder spree so well that he had even managed to frame someone to take the fall for him. But after the massacre of the Rothschild branch in Naples, things became clear that the Rothschilds were being targeted, and there was no mercy being granted to them. Not only were the men being shot in the streets, having their throats slit in their sleep, and having the grand misfortune of being run over by trains, but the women and children were not spared the violence either. By now, the Rothschilds had estimated there was a grand conspiracy looming in the shadows, men who had become aware of their plots to destabilize the world and establish hegemony over it in the aftermath. And these conspirators were targeting those in charge. But it wasn't just the Rothschilds who were dropping like flies. Other prominent bankers, businessmen, industrialists, etc. were having mysterious deaths, which were no doubt being caused by this shadowy cabal. At first, the Rothschilds and their conspirators thought that perhaps the men involved in trying to get Britain out of the war were involved with whoever was hunting them down like strays. But with their assassin being killed in the middle of his attempt to eliminate these prominent British officials, it became clear that whoever was targeting them was operating at a level of clandestine warfare well above their own. Had the family known for financing the rise of the Habsburgs come to realize that it was a single man killing them in the dozens, if not hundreds, they might genuinely die of an aneurysm from the sheer overwhelming shock and rage of such a fact. It was perhaps because Eric was operating as a lone wolf that it had become damn near impossible to find out just who was behind these attacks. The man, after all, had extensive military, law enforcement, and espionage training. An expert marksman to boot, and having a wide experience working with demolitions, Eric's skills were almost tailor-suited to the task he had been given by Bruno. He never even asked why he was being sent to kill so many people, many of which were women and children, nor was he actually being paid under the table to do so. No, Eric was a chained hound, and where his master pointed, he attacked. That was all there to it. Loyalty? Fortune? No such things motivated his swift hand as it stabbed the enemies of the Reich within the back from behind. His sole reason was the violence he was being permitted to conduct. And because of this, the man was perfect for the task. The kind of man who would rather die in a firefight with those pursuing him than surrender and potentially be forced to yield critical information. This was the whole reason Bruno had kept Eric alive, despite his rebellious tendencies. After all, a mad dog was prone to trying to break free from his bindings should a stray rabbit cross his path at any given moment. Because since the moment he gained the nickname the Terror of Belgorod, Eric had proven to Bruno that he was a valuable tool, one that could be honed to kill his enemies from the shadows when the time came to do so. And that time was now, especially as Eric stood in front of a burning automobile, one which he had caused to be lit aflame. Evidently, the wreckage had been lit for some time, as the corpses within had long since turned to bone, their flesh and organs burned away by the supreme temperatures which had claimed their life. What exactly had killed the passengers inside the car? That was a very good question, one which Eric seemed to be the only person aware of the answer. Either way, it was evidently safe for consumption, as the man pulled out a cigar and lit it with the burning wreckage, one that no doubt by now had triggered a response from the local fire department. After taking a smoke from his cigar and gazing upon his handiwork with a sadistically satisfied smirk, Eric turned away and adorned his cap, using it to conceal his presence as he walked into the darkness, fleeing the scene of his most recent crime in a string of murders that spanned across Europe. Though it would be extremely difficult to identify the corpses, eventually the answer would reveal that Karl Artelt and Lothar Popp, the infamous leaders of the Kiel Mutiny, which had aided in the Kaiser's abdication and the collapse of the German Navy during the end of the Great War of Bruno's past life, were among the deceased within the flaming automobile. Discover exclusive tales on Freeweb Novel. Few would think anything of their deaths, but when Bruno read the names in the paper, he would happily cross a few names off of his list and would nod his head in satisfaction, knowing that his mad dog was completing his job quite efficiently if he had already gotten to this point of the list of targets he had been given. Frankly speaking, the death of these two men was inconsequential to the timeline, as the conditions required for the Kiel Mutiny to begin had already been prevented. Even so, Bruno would not rest until all of those from his past life, who were responsible for the defeat of the German Reich during the Great War and all that followed with it, were held responsible for the crimes they had committed in that timeline, here in this new life. After all, one should never suffer a traitor to live. Should they have the chance to get rid of them permanently? To do so would be to invite another betrayal later on, one which Bruno was wise enough to prevent before such a thing could ever manifest itself. Chapter 324, Logistic Simplicity. Shells were loaded into the back of a 15 centimeters gun as the crew fired the weapon, before ejecting the spent cartridge only to begin the process again. The heavy artillery was dug in behind concrete reinforced trenches at the rear echelons of the battlefield. All the while the Austro-Hungarian army tried its darndest to push through the Italian defenses. throwing bodies at the problem until it solved itself. If there was one upside to the fact that the Austro-Hungarians had aligned themselves with the Germans and Russians, it was the fact that they had all decided to standardize weapons and munitions midway through the war. Because of this, every Austro-Hungarian rifleman was equipped with a selective fire battle rifle, which was largely based upon the Fedorov Avtomat of Bruno's paced life. The differences being it was chambered in the German 7.92 by 57 mm Mauser cartridge and utilized MG-13 style magazines. In addition to this, the stubby grip was removed for the end of the rifle, but more or less everything else was the same. Meanwhile, Austro-Hungarian and Russian soldiers also adopted the G43 semi-automatic rifle as a sniper and were primarily issued to those who had perfected their marksmanship scores. And while the Germans themselves had largely replaced the MG08 machine gun with the MG34, the variation of the Maxim gun Bruno had improved upon in this life was still standard issue to Austro-Hungary and Russia. Other sharing of military technology included the issuing of the MP-34 submachine gun to NCOs and officer. When it came to small arms, more or fewer munitions, magazines, and belts were completely interchangeable between the three factions. This had many practical benefits for the war effort. Whether it was the scale of manufacturing, logistic simplicity, or sharing of resources in the field, the Central Powers had an advantage in all of these things. If, for example, one of the Central Powers nations had manufactured more rifles than the quota demanded, they could give the spares to an ally, and those soldiers would not only have the right ammunition for it, but they would also have the training necessary to operate the weapon efficiently in the field. This also applied to the sharing of ammunition on the battlefield. If a soldier ran dry on ammunition in his magazines, he could ask an ally from any of the nations fighting beside him for extra, and he could quickly insert it into his rifle, and it would fire without issue. The Allies did not have this benefit. In fact, the only technology they really shared was the use of the Mk2 tank, which was a joint project between Great Britain and France. But when it comes to the use of weapons, loading mechanisms, and ammunition, there was not a single unified standard among the Allied powers. This created many difficulties that their enemies did not have to face. And because the Germans had motorized logistics, they could effectively bring their spare resources to their allies at any battle that was being waged nearby. Find more to read at Freeweb Novel, which is exactly what was happening now to the Austro-Hungarians. Bruno's trucks came to their aid as they began to run low on artillery shells time and again. Meanwhile, the Italian crewman was forced to yell at their French and British allies whose weapons used entirely different shells. "I'm out of ammo." It was not like the French and British soldiers spoke Italian, and because of this their crews began to bicker in 3 different languages, as their position began to become shelled by the Austro-Hungarian artillery, which lay on the other side of the battlefield. It was a shit show of the highest magnitude, and it did not take long before the French generals realized what was happening, as their scouts had spotted trucks painted in camouflage and bearing German markings making their way to the rear echelon, where they distributed much-needed supplies to their allies. Worst of all, it was not like they could ambush these supply trucks, because they were guarded by armored cars and half-tracks, which were a nightmare for the Allied infantry to deal with. Because of this, the French general was quick to inform the Italian general in charge of this sector of defense that the battle was lost and that they should withdraw when they had the means to do so. I hate to say it, but we have been completely outmatched here. The Austro-Hungarians not only are overwhelming our men by sheer volume of fire with their automatic rifles, but they appear to have an endless supply of ammunition as well. Though it pains me, I have to admit this battle is lost. We should retreat while we still have the means to do so. We have held off long enough. A fresh supply of reinforcements should be arriving in Venice. They will come to our aid soon enough. The British general leading his attaché to this sector of the border also appeared to be in agreement, as he was quick to add some valuable information as well. There's no point resisting any longer. The Germans have already broken through the strongest point in our defense. If they really wanted to, they could circle around us from behind and cut off our escape at any time. If we don't leave now, this land will become a graveyard. Knowing all of this, the Italian general could only sigh and shake his head before commenting on the foolishness of his king for choosing the wrong side in this war. albeit in a way that did not outright provoke his allies. God save us all, for I fear my king underestimated the strength of our opponent when he chose to get involved with this nonsense. It was a sentiment that they all shared. Nobody expected the Central Powers to have so many forward-thinking ideas and to have spent the last decade implementing them to the best of their ability. But logistics won wars, and the Germans had perfected this art thanks to Bruno's interference in the timeline. And thus the order to retreat was swiftly given, causing the defenders to abandon their positions and equipment as they fled from the battlefield, allowing in a decisive Austro-Hungarian victory, one which they hoped would precede many to come. Chapter 325, Plausible Deniability. Revolutionary sentiment within France had been curbed for a time, but after suffering through continuous defeats on the battlefield, it became clear that the people had been lied to by those in power. And this had once more caused protests to break out across the country. Whether it was the Marxist revolutionaries who sought to install a communist utopia within the borders of France, or right-wing reactionaries who blamed the defeats in 1871 and the ongoing losses during the Great War on their own failing republic. All who wished to participate in civil unrest were making their voices heard. To combat these protests, the French government began to crack down on them, dispersing any gathering of 10 or more people with law enforcement agencies, while imposing a curfew on all citizens. In addition to this, anyone caught spreading defeatist sentiment was jailed without proper legal recourse, only further adding to the powder keg that was waiting to blow. You see, if someone had a grievance, whether legitimate or otherwise, the last thing you wanted to do was silence them. Because if you took away the ability of the people to speak of their concerns, whether through legal means or by trying to ruin their livelihood via socio-economic pressure, then the only thing that remained to express what they believed was violence. It was perhaps one of the reasons Bruno had feared in his past life the future of his own nation, as when government figures came out stating that free speech should not be permitted if it allowed the rise of dissenting viewpoints, well then those people who believed such things had only one option left to get their point across: explore stories at freeweb novel. And when that happened, civil war was but a stone's throw away from engulfing the nation. Public debate and political discourse were the lifeblood of a republic. If you began to suppress opinions you did not like, you only encouraged them to become violently dissident. This was not a problem for more authoritarian governments such as monarchies, dictatorships, and other forms of autocracies, as they did not falsely preach lofty ideals such as free speech, equality, and democracy, nor would they care to. But in a republic, founded under so-called democratic ideals, to reject these notions for thee, but not for me, was hypocrisy. And hypocrisy was something universally despised by human cultures around the world. For example, if a leader of a nation was to call themselves an autocrat and openly preach that they were going to suppress the people's freedom of speech, infringe upon their so-called human rights, rig elections in their party's favor, assuming they even had elections in the first place, imprison their political rivals, and outlaw political parties which expressed disagreement with their worldview, most people would accept it. These were the rules they lived in, and while this autocrat in power might be bad, at least he was honest about what he was doing. But for the democratically elected politicians who espoused the exact opposite of this behavior, and yet conducted themselves in the same manner, this could not be tolerated. Why was one acceptable and the other was not? Hypocrisy. That alone was a sufficient reason for people to rise up in rebellion. And this was also the straw that broke the camel's back within the French Republic. For a nation which painted the nations of the Central Powers as autocratic hellholes with no regard for the principles of the Enlightenment and democracy, the Republic's own leaders were behaving precisely such. Thus, once more, violence was being conducted in the streets, the scale and scope of which varied per region. For example, in Paris, where the government had the number of law enforcement and gendarmes available to protect law and order, violence was limited to a few minor engagements between protesters of various political backgrounds, as well as with the agents of the Republic. Built in the countryside, everything from bombings, stabbings, shootings, etc. But oddly enough, Bruno did not have a role to play in any of this. His focus was on the war effort, and crushing the French army in a way so devastating that the French would never threaten to test the might of the Reich again. His strategic goal was to protect the German borders and the unification of the Reich, as well as to crush the will of the French to fight any further wars in the future. And aiding the chaos occurring within the Republic right now was counter to those goals, as the French could always use German contributions to the escalation of violence as justification for future wars. And what would be the purpose of being reincarnated into this timeline and fighting the Great War if the Second World War would occur in the future regardless? Or such were Bruno's thoughts. Was the possibility of ending the hostilities sooner through aiding and abetting French revolutionary forces a possibility? Most certainly, but it was short-term thinking. And Bruno would not sacrifice the long-term objectives he had in mind for such petty gains. However, not everybody within a position of power within the German Reich had a similarly long-term view of this conflict. To Bruno, this was the war that single-handedly ended Western civilization and put humanity on a route to certain ruin. A new dark age loomed on the horizon in his past life, and this war was the cause of it. But nobody could possibly understand such a thing, not a normal person who had not lived through the consequences of the Great War. Most men thought in terms of short-term tangible benefits. Few had the ability to think 5 years advance, let alone 10, and God forbid an entire century. Thus, there were people within the Bundesrat, Reichstag, and German High Command who very much wanted to supply the French rebels. And why wouldn't they? The Imperial German Army had hundreds of thousands of Mauser 98s lying in storage, and even more Gur 88s. Scrub a few markings here, rechamber the rifles into 8mm Lebel there, chop the barrel into a carbine length, and bam, you have a rifle that is butchered just enough to give doubt towards its origins. After all, the Mauser 98 action had been adopted by militaries around the world and came in a wide variety of cartridges. It would be very difficult to precisely pin such butchered weapons scrubbed of all markings on the German Reich. Sure, everyone may know that the Germans were the ones providing such weapons to French revolutionaries, but the term plausible deniability existed for a reason. And that was exactly what German High Command had done to further instigate the ongoing civil strife within the French Republic, something which, when Bruno discovered, would not be the least pleased with.